Welcome to episode 15 of our Garden States Microdose monthly webcasts. I'm broadcasting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as anyone who might be tuned in to this live broadcast or to the future recording once it's available on our YouTube channel. I'd also like to recognise that we benefit from the knowledge and insights of First Nations people here in Australia and First Nations around the world, including their long relationship with the original technology, plants, fungi, and our relationship with them. If you know what country you are on, I'd love for you to drop that into the comments now, and if you're up for it, briefly introduce yourself to the others who are here in the YouTube live chat today. It's a great opportunity to meet other people, other like-minded people, find the others, find the other others, and make some connections, because that's one of the things that we really foster here at EGA, and it's something that's harder to do in the online environment, but not impossible. So if you're up for it, do introduce yourself and get chatting. So thanks to those who are already getting onto that. My name is Nick Wallace. I'm the co-founder of the Australian Psychedelic Society, producer of the former 3CR program Psychedelia. I've also spent the past better part of a decade volunteering and working in a variety of capacities in harm reduction, including being a board member of Harm Reduction Victoria and working in the party scene in harm reduction. I'm personally very passionate about not just seeing an end to the drug war, an end to prohibition, but also a growing and fostering of our community, of our vibrant community, and making sure that it stays that way, and helping to create those connections and build that community and keep it there. And EGA is an important part of that. EGA provides those opportunities for critical thinking and knowledge sharing at that meeting place between plants, fungi, mind, and culture. EGA embrace the psychedelic in the broadest sense of the word, and there's many different interpretations of that word, but I've always thought of it as much broader than the experience, the psychedelic experience in and of itself, and much broader than the sort of aesthetic that might be associated with psychedelic, especially the sort of 60s tie-dye sort of aesthetic. When I think of psychedelic, I think of the interconnectivity of that experience, and how that is interpreted in your broader life, on integration, on integrating that experience and moving past the experience being the catalyst for that. It might catalyze that, but it's not all there is. So EGA really embraced that, and that's where we can really find the connections between science, culture, policy, and nurturing that grassroots community that holds this all together. Let's have a look now quickly at the EGA website. Gardenstates.org is the website. I should also add, over the past month since we've last met, I've moved house and had COVID, got the plague, along with, I imagine, many other people, because a lot of people that I've spoken to have managed to get the plague over the past month. It has been a bit chaotic in those terms, so hope everyone is feeling well. If you're not feeling well, it won't take long, and just look after yourself, and if things do get worse, do seek medical assistance. Gardenstates.org. Very important that you head to the website, especially if you've been looking out for tickets for the event, because tickets are now on sale. For everyone that pre-registered for the event, you would have got a discount code, discount voucher sent out to you over the past week. If you've missed that one, go back and check your emails. Make sure to check your spam. Make sure to whitelist the EGA address. The address it would have come from is tickets@entheogenesis.org. And if you have any questions about that, or if you missed it entirely, do get in contact with the EGA team, tickets@entheogenesis.org, and I'll ask that our moderators in the comments drop that email in there. So here we are on the website, and as you will see, buy tickets now. Let's zoom right in on that. Buy tickets now, click that one, and ta-da, white screen. Here is the buy tickets now. You can now book your tickets, unless something devastating happens, which, touch wood, I don't think it will at this stage. It seems like just about everything that has been devastating has already happened, but You know, you never know. You can buy those tickets now. Friday, the 2nd of December until Sunday, the 4th of December is when the event is on. Plenty of speakers, as we just saw on the last page. So make sure to grab your tickets. If you have already purchased a ticket, of course, those tickets will still be valid as well. So as I mentioned, this is Webcast 15, and we will be doing webcasts every month on the last Wednesday of the month up until the up until our live event, and probably ongoing past then as well, because we quite enjoy doing this, and there's always a lot to speak about. You can sign up for that by making sure that you are connected with entheogenesis.org. The place to go is entheogenesis.org/connect, and then you can get the newsletter straight in your inbox with all the latest updates from EGA. You can also find resources at the EGA website, and there have been a plethora of new resources being added. And it's not just the EGA website that you will find the resources. It's also our YouTube channel, so I hope that you're subscribed. If you're not, make sure to hit subscribe now, and you'll find playlists that are relevant for tonight as well. So we'll go under playlists. I'll show you this now. Active Mushrooms and Friends is the playlist that you will be wanting to bookmark, save somewhere, because that playlist has all of these videos in it. So far there are 7, and I hear there is another one that will be added soon, covering all the active varieties that you will find across Australia, and lots of information about things like lookalikes, things like active allied species, other information, and it's really a great source of information there. Remember, again, we're live tonight. We will be doing a Q&A. That Q&A will be happening probably in about an hour's time, so we'll be getting through a big chunk of content before we get to our Q&A. If you do have questions, make sure to drop them in the chat along the way, and our moderators will be picking those up, and we'll be saving those so that we can come to those once we get to it. And for anybody who might have friends or family who you think might be interested in this sort of content, please do share the YouTube videos with them, the YouTube channel, the EGA links and resources. We have recently hit our 8,000 subscribers mark, and we'd love to hit 10,000 by the end of the year. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you're watching this back later, not live, the conversation always continues in all of those various different social media forums, so engage with us, keep that conversation going, keep it thriving online. We're always there to answer questions, to have a conversation about whatever it is that you want to talk about. Finally, I just want to mention that the EGA t-shirt, which I am wearing, it's probably going to disappear, but oh yep, there it is. The EGA t-shirt, which is from izwoz.com, that's izwoz.com.au. That is still available. There's a limited number available, and the profits will be donated to EGA, helping us to do things like this and to work towards building resources, putting together videos, and of course putting together the in-person event. And thank you also to all of those who were able to donate to tonight's webcast. It is freely available for you, but we really appreciate if you are able to donate. Then that really helps us to do all of this. I think I've covered all the things that I wanted to cover, so let's get into tonight's episode 15 of our Microdose Webcast. We're spreading spores for amateur foragers and professional mycologists alike. Emerging research around psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy, drug law reform, ecological sustainability, harm reduction, and mycological research, all intersecting and with the needs and values of our ethnobotanical community. Please accept our invitation for you to join us, which you are now, at the myceliating edge. I think that's a made-up word, but I like it. All 4 made-up words of psychedelic fungi. Tonight we will be hearing from Dr. Alistair McTaggart, Dr. Martin Williams, Kane Barlow and Simon Beck, and there'll be a series of segments leading us into the evening tonight with a Q&A around the middle. So our first session tonight comes from Kane Barlow. Kane is a mycologist and fungi educator based in Melbourne. He gives regular talks on mycology, fungi conservation, and teaches gourmet mushroom cultivation. He's a member of the Australian organisations Entheogenesis Australis, My Community Applied Mycology, the Australian Psychedelic Society, and the Entheome Foundation. Kane started foraging for mushrooms in the early 90s and started cultivating gourmet fungi in the mid-2000s. Kane did his Bachelor of Science at the University of Tasmania and a Master of Science at the University of Melbourne, where his research project was based around conservation mycology. In addition to fungi, Kane has had a long-term interest in ethnobotany, ethnobotanical literature, and growing medicinal plants, in particular cacti and acacias. Kane writes for Double Blind and Third Wave, is a trusted identifier on the shroomery, a moderator on many Facebook fungi-related groups, and Kane posts regularly on his Instagram at Gorilla Mycology, and that's not the animal kind of gorilla. Sharing adventures from cultivation, foraging, and ethnomycology to interesting observations from his home lab. Let's go first now to Kane. This is the EGA Microdose Webcast.
Hello, my name is Kane Barlow. I'm a mycologist and fungi educator. I have an interest in fungi conservation and communicating the amazing world of fungi to everybody. I get really excited about fungi, and I love communicating knowledge about fungi and just helping people learn about them. In this video, we're going to cover some basics on how to identify fungi. So where do we start? The fungi in your local environment are based on where you are. What is your climate? Are you in a temperate or a tropical climate? What's the time of year? Is it spring or autumn, winter or summer? Your habitat, where are you looking? Are you looking in fields or forests? And of course, substrate. The mushrooms that you're finding, are they growing on dung or grass or wood? With all that in mind, and having researched the fungi that you're likely to find where you are and these other conditions, so your climate, time of year, habitat, substrate, how then are you identifying the fungi that you're finding? To begin with, it's important to observe and note the features. Try to identify the fungus that you're finding using a number of resources. There's lots of printed resources, so ID guides and keys, which I'll come back to. There's also lots of really good online resources. So there's local Facebook groups. So try to join a Facebook group that's local to your region, not just your country, but to your more specific area. So if you're in Victoria, join the Victorian fungi group. Tasmania, join a Tasmanian fungi group. There are plenty of other resources as well. So there's the iNaturalist website or the iNaturalist app, where you can take photographs, upload them, and other people interested in fungi can then identify your fungi for you. It's also a great way to explore your local environment. There are other websites as well, so Mushroom Observer, and of course there's the Shroomery. I mentioned keys. So you'll notice on the right-hand side of this slide, there's a kind of a stepwise illustration where you can look at features of the mushrooms, like the gills, for example, how the cap is attached to the stem, the colours, etc., etc. And using this stepwise process, you can make decisions about the features, and that will help you to at least to get to genus. I mentioned climate zones, so I'm going to talk to this very briefly in case you haven't really thought about what climate you're in or where you are. If you're located in Australia, in Victoria, then the coastal part of Victoria and pretty much all of Tasmania is classified as an oceanic climate. Inland Victoria and parts of South Australia would be classified as Mediterranean, for example. And then as you head further north into northern New South Wales or Queensland, this would be classified as humid subtropical. Knowing your local climate zone is important in terms of being able to work out what fungi you're likely to find in your local area, but also to help guide what ID guides to purchase for yourself. So there are lots of amazing guides, and I will come back to these later in the presentation. So in terms of identifying fungi, I'm going to talk to a little bit of classification. So macrofungi are the fungi that we're looking for, and these are broken down into two broad groups, the Basidiomycota and the Ascomycota. I'm not going to talk to these specifically because then we're really getting into in-depth fungi taxonomy, and we're just looking at how to identify fungi from broad features. There are an incredible variety of mushrooms. They come in all kinds of shapes, sizes and forms. There's the common agarics, so your guild fungi. Then there are conchs, so Ganodermas for example. There's polypores and leathers, puffballs, earth stars and bird's nest fungi. There are also corals, cages, stinkhorns, the sea anemone, Acerorubra, cups, discs and morels and truffles. It's really quite astounding the variety of different forms that the fungi have evolved for their different environments and their different ecological niches. So when you're looking at a fungus, does it have gills or pores? Or what other kind of spore-bearing surface does it have under the cap? In most cases, we're probably the most familiar with the guild fungi, with these very, very thin, narrow structures that sit on the underneath of the cap. But some fungi also have pores, this sponge-like texture that sits on the underside of the cap with these tiny holes. Some have tiny holes and some have quite large holes. Other fungi have ridges, and then some also have teeth. The fungi that we're focusing on today are the guild fungi. So what are the identifying features of agarics? So the main features are your pileus, which is your cap, your stipe, which is your stem, lamellae, which are your gills, and then also the mycelium. Additional features that you might be looking at are the universal veil, which is often present in the form of remnants on the cap. So Amanita muscaria is a great example here, where it has those warts on the top of the cap. Also a vulva, so Amanita phalloides, the death cap, for example, is a great example there, where it has this distinctive cup at the base of the stem. Other features are partial veils. Some fungi have this beautiful cobweb kind of coating to the cap, and as the cap expands, this partial veil kind of peels away. In some cases, these partial veils are left as an annulus or a skirt. All these terms are illustrated here in this illustration on the right. We can then look closer at the mushroom, and we can look at these finer features. So the gill attachments, how the gills are attached to the stem, and then also the cap shapes. It's important to keep in mind that the cap of a mushroom changes over time. So quite often a cap will start as, for example, in the case of Amanita muscaria, it will start out as globose, so it's very circular. It will expand to become hemispherical. Then in time it will become flat, and then later in its life it becomes upturned. Another aspect of the cap shapes is that fungi within the same species can also present with different cap shapes. So some may have a hemispherical shape, whereas others may be bell-shaped, and others again may be really quite umbonate. So this is where it's kind of good to introduce other terminology. So for example, with gill attachment, because gill attachment is quite consistent. So having a look at the underneath of the cap, at the gills and how they attach to the stem. We have free attachment, attached, decurrent, and notched. When you start to go through your identification guides, you're going to strike a lot of terminology. Some less so, some are really quite detailed. So it's good to have a bit of an understanding of some of the terms that you may find. So, for example, when we're describing the pileus, the cap, you might come across terms such as campanulate, which is bell-shaped, conical, convex, depressed, flat, etc. In some cases, they may just use more general terminology. For example, as I mentioned, bell-shaped. Caps can also have other features. So some species, for example, have a separable pellicle or they're hygrophanous. Hygrophanous meaning that the cap will change colour over time. The separable pellicle is like a thin gelatinous layer that sits on the top of the cap. And when you break the cap and gently peel it apart, you'll find this beautiful gelatinous layer, as illustrated in this slide. There are also a bunch of terms for describing the lamellae, the gills, and how they attach to the stem. So adnate, adnext, decurrent, which means running down the stem, free, not attached to the stem at all, succeeding, sinuate, decurrent, etc. And these are illustrated here on the right hand side. And in this slide, this is an example of an adnate to adnext attachment. Sometimes this can be a little bit confusing because movement of the cap means that attachment can break. So it's best to try to slice as best you can through the cap to see how that attaches across a number of gills. I've included this slide to illustrate an adnate to adnext attachment. I've sliced this mushroom in half in order to illustrate how the gills are attached. In some cases though, you might notice that the gills have slightly broken away from the stem. So if you find this as well, just slice again till you can kind of see what the attachment looks like. Another important feature of mushrooms is also their spores. Spores can be really helpful in identifying to different genera. So some fungi have brown spores, others white, pink, etc. So it's helpful to do a spore print. So this can be onto either foil or paper or even glass slides. Glass slides are great because depending on what spore colour, you can still see them clearly on the glass, whereas on paper or foil, this might be slightly obfuscated due to the media. If you're interested in learning about how to make a spore print, there is a fantastic resource on the Entheogenesis website under resources. I come back to keys again, and I've mentioned a variety of different features, so gill attachment, cap shape, and spore colour. So if you look closely at this particular slide, you can see this stepwise process. So looking to see whether gills are free or attached, spore colours a mushroom might have, etc, etc. And you can step down through these choices to hopefully get to the genus of the mushroom that you've picked or you're interested in. Here we have Amanita muscaria, the archetypal magic mushroom, the mushroom that inspires so many stories of fairies and goblins and other mythical tales through history. It has that beautiful red cap with those really lovely white warts, these little speckles that are remnants of the universal veil. If we look here at this mushroom here, this is an Amanita muscaria that's just emerging from the soil. You can see it has these cracks in the universal veil as the cap is expanding. That universal veil is cracking, and you can see the red, that beautiful red colour emerging from underneath. In time, this cap will expand. Unlike this specimen over here, the cap will become globose. You can see that the cap's expanded, the red's starting to show, and those warts, the remnants of the universal veil, are starting to spread apart. In time, it'll start to look like this, where the cap is a little bit more than hemispherical. You can see the cap is slightly more than semi-hemispherical. It's going to expand and it's going to slowly flatten out, and will in time look like something like this here. In fact, this one's starting to upturn a bit. It's got a little bit of a cup in the middle and it's gathering water. You can see that the mushroom here in this state is also starting to lose some of that red colour. It's going slightly orange and slightly yellow. You can see here also the margins of the cap. You can see those gills starting to show through. If we pick one of these mushrooms, and you can see here at the base of the mushroom, so this is the base, so this would have formed part of that universal veil. There's some little remnants left on the stem. Further up the stem we have the annulus, this kind of partial veil here that would have protected the gills while the cap was developing within the universal veil. We have these beautiful white gills. They're really distinctively white. And if you focus in, you can see that the gills have a free attachment. They're not attached to the stem. And then of course, there's that beautiful red cap with those white dots, those white warts, the remnants of the universal veil. Incredible, stunning mushroom. Now we can see the inside of the mushroom. We have that kind of beautiful red cap, and we have this yellow coloration underneath that red layer. We can see the gills here with this free attachment. So they're not attached to the stem at all, they're just attached to the underside of the cap. The bulbous base, and then we have this slightly hollow stem. We've been lucky enough to find Amanita phalloides. This is the death cap. This is a very, very poisonous mushroom. It grows in a mycorrhizal symbiosis with oak trees, and you can see all the oak trees here scattered around it. It sometimes does get confused with edible species, particularly the straw mushroom. So here we have the vulva. So this is the remnants of the universal veil. This is the membrane that encloses the entire mushroom as it develops from its primordial state. As it grows, the cap and the stem expand and breaks free from this membrane, leaving this cup-like structure. In some cases, this gets washed away in some amanitas, so even though it may have had a vulva, it's no longer present. The stem will expand, the cap will then open, and the partial veil that's protecting the gills will then fall away, leaving the partial veil, which is also termed the annulus or the skirt. This is the cap. You can see that kind of yellow that's becoming kind of ever so slightly olive green. And underneath we have the gills, which are this kind of white, slightly creamy, yellowy colour. And if we were to look right up underneath, we would see that the gills have a free attachment. So we can see in the reflection here, we have the vulva, which is the remnant of the universal veil. Further up the stipe, you can see the annulus, which is the remnant of the partial veil. And then we have the cap, the pileus, which is this kind of yellow colour, slightly turning green colour. You can see the gills have this beautiful kind of white to slightly cream colour that is typical of Amanita. In all these videos that we've been doing, we've been speaking to active species. So I'm going to speak to the genus Psilocybe and allied species. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about different climate zones. And this is kind of a good illustration of the different kinds of fungi that you're going to find based on your different climate. So in humid, subtropical and tropical zones, for example, you're likely to find Psilocybe cubensis or Panaeolus cyanescens. Examples of fungi in different climates. So I've mentioned a couple of different climate types, so humid, subtropical, tropical, but also temperate. And these are two broad major zones that we have in Australia. So examples of species that occur in humid, subtropical, tropical, for example, in Australia are Ganoderma staetinum, which is a very distinctive Queensland Ganoderma that grows in forests, is lignicolous and grows on trees. Another species that's quite common is Chlorophyllum molybditis, which occurs in open grasslands. This is a common lookalike for many of the Macrolepiotas. So Macrolepiota clelandii, for example, or Macrolepiota dolichula that I have listed here. So both of these occur in open grasslands. For temperate species, for oceanic climates, for example, we have Amanita muscaria and also Amanita phalloides, both good examples of temperate species. So these occur in forests and parklands, and they grow mycorrhizally in association with trees. So Amanita muscaria, for example, in association with pine, spruce, birch, and Amanita phalloides in association with oaks. Another common temperate species is the Agaricus species that occur in open grasslands, the really common edible kind of foraged Agaricus. And as a counterpoint to Ganoderma staetinum, which only grows in humid subtropical regions, we have Ganoderma austral, which grows in temperate regions. So Tasmania and Victoria, for example, in forests, and again, it's the same. It's lignicolous, so it grows on trees. In a temperate environment, so the oceanic climate, you're likely to find Psilocybe from the section cyanescens. So in Australia, this will be Psilocybe suberugonosa. In North America or in the UK, this will be Psilocybe cyanescens. Pacific Northwest of America, Psilocybe azurescens and Psilocybe allenii. Another temperate species is Psilocybe semilanceata, which is found in Tasmania and Victoria, New Zealand, but then also in northern United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Another climate zone is humid continental, and I'm going to mention here a species common in the United States, Psilocybe ovoidiocystidiata. There are some common features of Psilocybe. So many Psilocybe share common features, such as they're typically little brown mushrooms. They're solitary to gregarious, and they're rarely found in clusters. So they typically occur on their own or in groups of 2s or 3s, although in woodchip beds this changes quite dramatically, and you can find a huge masses of them in a small area. They typically have blue bruising of the cap, stem and gills to varying degrees. So some species will only have a tiny little bit of bruising, but some species like Psilocybe suberugosa will have quite a lot. This is quite a distinctive feature, this bruising feature. And I highlight the word bruising because we're not looking at the colour of the mushroom itself. This is a change in the colour. It's quite a dramatic change that may occur within minutes to hours. Another feature is the purple-black spore print. In some species this is lilac brown, and in rare cases where there's a genetic mutation in the pigment, the spores may actually turn up as brown, which can be quite confusing given the brown spore prints of the lookalikes Galerina and Cortinarius. They have smooth hygrophanous caps, slightly sticky or a moist looking texture. And this cap changes colour as it dries out. So it will go from the beautiful caramel brown to a lighter brown, or to even like a cream or kind of off-white colour. The name Psilocybe means bare-headed, and this refers to that separable pellicle that I demonstrated in a few slides back. Many field guides still contain non-bruising Psilocybe species, and these are likely to have been moved to other genera, such as Diconica. I'm going to talk to some common field guides. So recommended field guides include a field guide to Australian fungi by Bruce Fuhrer. It has lots of beautiful photographs and some really good descriptions. This is a good overall guide for Australia. If you're looking to more specific regions, say for example your tropical to subtropical region, Australian Subtropical Fungi by Sapphire McMullen Fisher, Patrick Leonard and Francis Gard is a really lovely guide for that area. For Tasmania and Victoria, a field guide to Tasmanian fungi is really good. And then there's also the matching fungi flip that works really well with that field guide. Wild Mushrooming by Alison Pulio and Tom May is a fantastic overall guide. It covers lots of the common edibles and also some of the lookalike poisonous species. There's Fungi Down Under, printed by Fungi Map. This is really helpful as well. Introduction to Mushrooms, Toadstools and Larger Fungi of Queensland is excellent. It's a really good guide. It's quite old now and getting a little hard to find, but it's really well illustrated and it has really good keys in it. Some of the names have likely changed, so it's best used in conjunction with other books. A really good guide is Roger Phillips' Mushrooms. This is a UK guide, but it's also really helpful for getting down to genus. It's really well illustrated, and it shows mushrooms at different parts of their life cycle, and it has those cross sections that can be really helpful. The Field Naturalist Club of Victoria has lots of PDFs on their website, and these are highly recommended to download and have on your phone. The keys that I've shown come from a field guide to the common genera of guild fungi in Australia. This is a really, really helpful printed guide to have. It's got lots of laminated sheets in it. It's great for having in the field for out in the rain or muddy environment. It's getting quite rare. It hasn't been printed now for a long, long time, but it's definitely worthwhile having. If you really want to get down to specifics, some good guides are the How to Identify Mushrooms to Genus. There's a whole series of them from 1 through to 6. They are starting to age a little bit now. There's some incorrect information due to the species just having moved around to different genera. But it covers macroscopic features to microscopic features and lots of helpful keys for getting down to family and genera. So these are some other useful field guides. So the Audubon Society Field Guide to North American Mushrooms by Gary Linkoff, Mushrooms Demystified by David Aurora, which is really lovely. It's a huge brick of a book, but it's a really stunning guide to have, and it's got lots of keys. And lastly, I'm going to mention some Australian organisations and their websites. So most notably, Entheogenesis Australis, and then there's also PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, the Australian Psychedelic Society, DanceWise, My Community Applied Mycology, and the forum, the Corroboree, which is hosted through Shaman Australis, which is an invaluable resource.
Learning to identify fungi is daunting to begin with. There are new words to learn and a new visual language to take in as you learn the features. Entheogenesis Australis has created this series of short videos describing a number of species of Psilocybe and allied species found in Australia. In this video, I'm going to introduce and discuss the temperate species Psilocybe suberugosa.
Hello, my name's Kane Barlow. I'm an Australian mycologist. I have a particular interest in the genus Psilocybe, particularly Australian species. Psilocybe suberugosa is a really well-known Australian species occurring in southeast Australia. It's an autumn and winter fruiting mushroom. It has a beautiful caramel brown cap, white to grey stem, and younger specimens have a partial veil. It has a hygrophonous cap, which means that the cap changes colour as it dries out. This can be quite distinct, going from like a really dark chocolate brown colour to almost cream, almost white. The species is heavily associated with Psilocybe cyanescens and Psilocybe azurescens. They're very closely related, and they can look quite similar. There's quite often a little bit of confusion around these three species. From a pharmacology perspective, Picker and Ricards in 1971 reported that there was psilocybin to 0.47% dry weight. In 1981, Perkel reported psilocybin between 0.6% to 1.93% by dry weight. The first herbarium collection of Psilocybe suberugosa was made by John Burton Cleland in 1915. During the following years, he and colleagues collected them from South Australia, New South Wales and Victoria. He named and described suberugosa formally in 1927. And the description was republished in his 2-volume books on toadstools and mushrooms from South Australia in 1934 and 1935. The species was confirmed as containing psilocybin in 1971 by Pickett and Rickards. In 1974, Roy Watling, the Scottish mycologist, made collections of Psilocybe australiana, Psilocybe eucalypta and Psilocybe tasmaniana from New South Wales and Tasmania. All four were synonymised as Seberogenosa by Chang and Mills in 1992. And then in 1995, Psilocybe tasmaniana was removed by Johnson and Buchanan. Psilocybe seberogenosa is found in wet and dry eucalyptus forests and occasionally on the edge of rainforests. They particularly enjoy growing on eucalyptus, but they're also quite often found in pine plantations. They have a reputation for growing in wood-chipped garden beds as well in urban settings. They're found in Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, in southwest Western Australia as an introduced species, and they're now reported to occur in southeast Queensland as well. We know them also from New Zealand, where they're very, very closely related to the endemic species there, Psilocybe wirroa. They require cold to fruit. So for fruiting to happen, the temperature needs to drop between 6 to 8 degrees C. They fruit between April to May to July to August, climate permitting. In an oceanic environment, they will fruit earlier, so late March even to April. But in the more Mediterranean environment, say inner Victoria, South Australia, we expect this more around May. This is an example of wet sclerophyll forest. You can see the eucalyptus, you can see the man ferns, Antarctica dixonii, and you might also have a few rainforest trees as well, Bedfordia, for example. Then we also have dry sclerophyll. The photograph shown here is very dry, with lots of rain. This can become quite wet, well saturated, and Psilocybe seberogenosa loves this. In this situation, you're also quite possibly more likely to find it on the edge of the forest rather than right in the middle. But it's always worth looking. So taxonomically speaking, the cap is 1 to 6 centimetres in diameter. This beautiful caramel brown, as I mentioned earlier, drying to yellow, sometimes light as cream. The cap is conical to convex. It uplifts in age and it has quite a prominent umbo. The gill attachment is adnate to adnext. The stem, anywhere between 4.5 to 22 centimetres long. They're really quite firm and quite fibrous. White in colour, turning grey with age, and then often brown when waterlogged. They have a really beautiful white partial veil. This can either disappear or quite often leaves a trace around the edge of the cap. Psilocybe bruise when damaged, and Psilocybe seberogenosa can bruise really quite strongly. Here are some examples of Psilocybe seberogenosa in their habitats. On the left you can see the white partial veil, the remnants around the edge of the cap, and quite a lot of the black purple spores still attached to that sticky partial veil. You can see this also on the right, and particularly in the right bottom right hand corner, you can see that uplifted cap with this sinusoidal appearance, hence the confusion with Psilocybe cyanescens. This is an example of Psilocybe seberogenosa in habitat, growing from really well colonised eucalyptus branch, and they love growing up through grass clumps, and you can see this here quite distinctly. Every now and then you will find them growing in really heavy clumps. Usually they're either singly or in little groups, but in this case, these are really heavily clumped together and indicative of really nutritious substrate. This photo shows their features really well. You can see that umbo on the top of the cap, the white partial veil around the edge, beautiful white stem, and you can see this grey appearance and also assumedly some of that blue bruising. The white gills that will in time turn kind of browny grey, and at the base of the stem some mycelium. The thing with Psilocybe seborrheicosa is there are quite a few lookalikes, and some of these are poisonous, particularly in the case of Gallerina, potentially deadly. Also Cortinarius, also potentially deadly. Hypholoma fascicular is poisonous, and then there are other species, Foliota, Protostropharia semiglobata, Gymnopilus, and Loradiomyces ceres can also look similar. The image here on the right hand side, you can see Loradiomyces ceres growing right next to a clump of seborrheicosa. So Psilocybe seborrheicosa, the pronunciation varies a lot with individuals. I tend to go with, I used to say psilocybe, but this was corrected through being exposed to other genus names, Cainocybe for example, hence Psilocybe. Seborrheicosa is a bit of a mouthful. I tend to break it down into little groups, so sub, eru, gyn, osa. But if you feel comfortable saying it in a particular way, then feel free to do that. Thank you for joining me today as we've explored a number of Australian Psilocybe species.
And thank you very much to Kane Barlow, our resident mycologist, mushroom expert, for those two talks. Again, we are live tonight. Sorry for a little hiccup we had earlier there, but we are still tracking your questions, comments in the comments section. Please do ask away. We will be doing a Q&A shortly, and we'll get to those and be able to address those in our Q&A session. We are on Microdose Webcast number 15, and tickets are now available for EGA's end of year Garden States event, and you can find those at the EGA website. And in fact, I'll just quickly show you the link here. There's the try booking website where you can book now and get your tickets finally. For those that were signed up, registered to get information about when tickets went on sale, you'll also have a discount code available for you, and that is in your email. If you haven't found it, again, just drop it into the chat and our moderators will get to that and be able to help you out. And for those that have already purchased a ticket, those of course are still available as well. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Michelle Janikian. Michelle is a journalist and the author of Your Psilocybin Mushroom Companion, the down-to-earth guide that details everything you need to know about taking magic mushrooms safely and mindfully. Michelle actively covers psychedelic and cannabis education, harm reduction and research in her work, which has been featured in Playboy magazine, Rolling Stone, High Times, Double Blind Mag, Psychedelics Today, and many more. She's passionate about the healing potential of psychedelic plants and substances and the legalization and destigmatization of all drugs. Born in New York City and raised in New Jersey, Michelle studied writing and psychology at Sarah Lawrence College before traveling extensively in Latin America and eventually settling down in southern Mexico. Michelle was recently awarded the Cosmic Sister Emerging Voices Award for her outstanding work covering the psychedelic renaissance. When she's not writing or speaking publicly about the magic of mushrooms, she can be found wandering the woods with her 2 rescue dogs and enjoying her 3rd cup of coffee with a good book. Her website is michellejanician.com, and we'll get the moderators to drop that in the chat so you've got that there. And I'd like to introduce now Michelle.
Hello everyone, I'm Michelle Janician, journalist, writer, and author of Your Psilocybin Mushroom Companion, an informative, easy-to-use guide to understanding magic mushrooms, from tips and tricks to microdosing and psychedelic therapy. I've been into mushrooms for a long time, over 15 years, mostly the psychedelic kind. That was kind of my gateway into other types of mushrooms, big surprise, because they're fascinating, to me anyway. Psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybin-containing mushrooms, which there's it's debatable, but as many as like 180 different species that contain psilocybin alone. But they're so interesting to me because there's such a long history. They can create such different experiences for people, such profound, crazy experiences that it's so wild that you can have just from eating, a few grams or a few mushrooms. But I'm here to talk to you guys about safe use because that's my specialty and what this whole book is about. I only have about 10 minutes, but I just want to go through a few of the basics of safe tripping, if we're being honest, with psychedelic mushrooms. And first I want to start with, I'm gonna go with dose. So I have a whole chapter in here on dose. It's I wrote this over 2 years ago. Chapter 7, finding the correct dose. And so what I recommend in chapter 7 is starting low, like really low, and going slow and working your way up to more profound dose trips in subsequent experiences, so not like all in one day. So the first thing I have to tell you is that different mushrooms have different strengths. So to give you like a lowdown of grams right now, doesn't really make the most sense. However, what I can say is most folks, if you're growing or buying mushrooms from someone, or, gifting, whatever, no judgment, mushrooms from someone who grows them at home, most likely they're growing Psilocybe cubensis. And so if you have cubensis, which then there's all these different strains, so they can vary in strength again. But my chapter in dose mostly deals with cubensis because they're the most common mushroom that people eat, just for fun or for therapy, whatever. However, since you guys are mushroom people, you might be foraging other types of species, or you might be growing your own signature strains or whatever. So this slight lowdown of grams doesn't apply to all species of mushrooms, essentially. However, we're talking about, in my book, dried Psilocybe cubensis, and I recommend folks start pretty low for their first journey. There's no need to go for a really, really big, strong experience. I don't think for your first time, if you're doing this just alone or with friends, if you have a guide, whatever, you can listen to them, what they think is best. But I recommend folks starting at either a microdose, which would be 0.2 grams, or a low dose, which is 0.5 dried grams, remember, to 1.2 for your first experience. And then you can work your way up. 2 to 3 grams is going to be a little stronger, 3.5 to 5 grams, pretty profound. And people go above that, when they're more experienced, looking for certain things, certain spiritual practices, go even deeper. But then that brings me to my next most important safe tripping advice is think about your set and setting first. And what I mean by that is your set refers to your mindset, just how both like how you're feeling and who you are like deep down in your personality. So it's like a very wide thing. This concept was come up by Timothy Leary, who was a psychologist at Harvard in the 60s until he got kicked out of Harvard for getting a little too into mushrooms. But and then your setting refers to where you're at, like your physical location. And so there's a few things you can do to just like prepare your set and setting. And I would also just like give them some consideration first. Just like, you don't have to plan too intensely. Don't like be too, you don't have to be too, over plan everything. But that's kind of the difference, I think, between like general safe use and more like party, or these bad experiences you hear people had in college and you're like, whoa, mushrooms are scary. It's like, no, you were just in a really stressful situation on a really profound substance. So what I recommend in the book is give it some thought. And I have all these recommendations of different things that people do through like interviews I did as a journalist with different mushroom, both experts and just regular folks who use mushrooms, in the course of their lives. But a lot of people like really chill environment. And that's what I also personally like. I love being in nature. If you can find, but that's also like, you want to find a really comfortable, safe place to have this experience, because it is going to last from like 4 to 8 hours, depending on the person and your body chemistry, how much you've eaten, those kinds of things. I also don't really like being around any strangers. It's like really overwhelming and increases my anxiety. It's not like smoking a joint in the park where it's kind of chill. Like for me, I'm going pretty deep. So I personally, like my ideal setting is like a comfortable campground or cabin or hotel room, even with like a beautiful view of nature or the ocean. That's like really special, maybe once a year or something. But yeah, finding a place that you're comfortable, that is really beautiful, can be really nice, but actually the being comfortable is the most important thing. So I think a lot of folks for their first journey, doing it at home, especially I feel like Australia, you guys have so much beautiful landscapes and stuff. You have a little backyard, you can just like look at the trees or at the night sky or whatever. But a lot of folks like to do it like at night at home. They won't be interrupted and they can just really go deep until they're more, and then like when you're more experienced and you kind of know how the mushrooms feel in your mind and your body, you might be ready to, take them on a little vacation in a moderate dose with like your best friend or your partner or by yourself for a really special, sometimes spiritual experience. I also want to talk about, like, I don't even know how to say this, how to trip, or like how to deal maybe when it gets kind of overwhelming and scary. A mushroom trip, like I said earlier, 4 to 6 hours generally. Sometimes you're still feeling a little funky at hour 8 or things like that. But it has kind of like an arc to it, almost like a novel, right? And so when it starts and you're just starting to feel a little different, you can feel kind of nauseous. And this I think is the hardest part, which I like to warn people, the come up. I feel kind of gross. I kind of feel terrible and scared most come ups. Like, why do I do this? I feel so horrible. And then after that only lasts about an hour, sometimes 2. It depends. And I feel like then I kind of arrive. Some people call that the peak. I don't know if that's, for me, I kind of get over the come up and plateau a bit. And then I kind of feel like, oh, I'm here. And then I can really just start exploring, just thinking about things in a new way, and myself and my life, where I'm at, or the beautiful place I'm in, or the partner I'm with. And then, there's that kind of a peak, and then you slowly come down. So if you feel really terrible in the first hour, just know that's kind of normal. And I have a whole chapter in my book on how to deal with challenging experiences. And those I do feel like is usually happening in the beginning. And, it's a lot of like the kinds of things you learn to deal with anger or anxiety, like in therapy, like breathe. Count to 10. If you're a meditator, you might want to try a little meditation, taking your shoes off, putting your bare feet on the ground, to ground you, to just make you feel like that you're not that you're in control, because you're not. The mushrooms are in control. That's another important thing to remember. But just to remember that, you can do this. It can be scary. It can be hard. You can look at yourself in a way that you haven't before, and that's kind of dark and, not what you thought it would be. I think that's a lot of it, is people's expectations are quite different than what happens. But the key is just like accept what's coming. You can't control the mushroom experience. You can prepare yourself. You can read my book. You can do more research. I definitely recommend doing more research and reading about the type of mushroom you're going to eat. But the best thing you can do is, once you're all prepared and you eat the mushrooms, is to just relax and to accept the mushrooms and whatever they bring you, and to know that they're in charge, but they're watching out for you. They're looking out for you. They're giving you something that they think you need. And I think you should trust them. You can set intentions and all those kind of things that I'm sure you start to read about online. In my book, I recommend my usual intention is to just to listen to the mushroom. I say, teach me, I'm listening, because I do trust the mushroom, and I want to know what they think I need to learn this trip, rather than trying to direct it really stiff and be like, oh, I need to work on all these things. No, I think those things naturally come up, and you can learn a lot. There's other tips like this in my book, and a whole chapter on integration, which is taking the lessons you've learned from mushroom experiences and starting to incorporate into your life. There's a lot of ways you can do that. There's a lot of other stuff on psychedelic therapy and guided experiences, how to vet guides and decide what kind of experience is right for you all. And this little book that I wrote in 2019, Your Psilocybin Mushroom Companion, it's available in Australia on Amazon for sure, and possibly at your local bookstore, especially if you request it. Yeah, that's all. I'm Michelle Janikian. I also have a website, michellejanikian.com, and I'm on Instagram most actively at michelle.janikian. Thanks so much, everyone. Much love, Australia. Bye.
Thank you very much to Michelle Janikian, Michelle's website, michellejanikian.com, and I'll get our moderators to drop that into the chat so that you can visit and find out more about the work that she does. This is the 15th EGA Microdose Webcast. Thank you for joining us live. Make sure to keep the comments and questions coming in the comment section. We will be doing a Q&A shortly, but before we do, we'll be hearing now from Dr. Martin Williams, PhD and Research Fellow in Medicinal Chemistry at the Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences at Monash University in Melbourne. He's the founding and current president of the DGR registered health promotion charity Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, or PRISM, founding and current vice president of the botanical/education charity Entheogenesis Australis, or EGA, and co-lead investigator of the upcoming Melbourne psilocybin trials at St Vincent's, I should say ongoing investigator at the at the Melbourne psilocybin trials at St Vincent's Hospital. Through PRISM, Martin and his colleagues have been advocating since 2011 for mental health research using psychedelic compounds in Australia, and in doing so have established connections with researchers here in Australia, in the USA, Canada, the Czech Republic, Germany, the Netherlands, and New Zealand and the UK. In the course of planning and seeking approvals for 2 clinical trials, one on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD, and the other for psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of anxiety and depression associated with terminal illness, Martin has become very familiar with the Australian regulatory and research governance landscape. Martin and the palliative care team at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne recently achieved the requisite human research ethics and state federal government approvals for the proposed phase 2 trial, which began in late January of 2020. He's currently working with another interdisciplinary research group on plans for a clinical trial of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression. Sorry, I've still got a bit of nasaliness from the plague, so a couple of those words are hicking me up a little bit. Martin Williams, welcome.
Hey, thanks very much. I think it's probably time for a CV update, so I'll send them through to you very soon. As you can see, apart from the Paul Clay-inspired graphics, which apparently are Microsoft PowerPoint's latest psychedelic sort of themed slide. I hope you'll accept that I'm going to sit with that for the talk. I'm just going to speak to this through my own notes, and but obviously today's talk this evening, I'll be giving a brief rundown of possible medical applications of psilocybin-assisted therapy, and I'll be giving an update on the current very encouraging directions in local research here in Australia. So just a historical perspective on research that has really morphed into the contemporary research, all of which is showing really positive results. Research into psilocybin-assisted therapy for the treatment of depression, anxiety, end-of-life distress, and then some other sort of broad-ranging but in some ways quite related disorders such as substance use disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, anorexia nervosa, and other eating disorders, and also possibly depression associated with early-stage dementia, all appear sort of amenable to treatment and quite effective treatment by psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And I have to stress that it's the psychotherapy aspect of the psilocybin treatment which appears very crucial to the effectiveness of the treatment overall. The first question is why are we using psilocybin as the drug of choice, the psychedelic of choice for psychedelic-assisted therapy treatments? You can refer back to my talk at Garden States, EGA Garden States in December of last year, 2021. But essentially, psilocybin represents a lot of advantages in terms of coming from natural sources, of course. It has a long and safe history of human use. Hence low toxicity and quite high potency. And so the effects of psilocybin, as many people would appreciate, really has a lot of potential for treatment of mental health conditions, primarily because it really gets to the heart of so many of our mental health conditions through some mechanisms that I'll sort of explain in a couple of minutes' time. Other advantages of psilocybin are that it has a moderate duration of action, so it appears to be quite useful in the psychotherapeutic context. By that I mean that it can be effective for usually between 3 and 5 hours, during which people are very amenable to the benefits of psychotherapy. There's a clarity of experience, which is to say that people can recall the experience in most cases that they went through during their therapy. There are other drugs, of course, which could be effective in some ways, but unfortunately they often cloud the memory of the experience, and so they reduce the therapeutic potential. And the other thing, of course, about psilocybin is that it has no residual physical or physiological effects. So after the effects of the drug have worn off, then the participant, the patient, anybody who takes psilocybin will have a clarity of thought and a recollection of the experience without a significant hangover of any particular kind. One relevant question which comes up from time to time, and I'm always happy to discuss this with people about the merits of biologically sourced psilocybin versus synthetic psilocybin. This is always an interesting topic of discussion, but for now, synthetic psilocybin is exclusively used in research. But I'm happy to say that developments are underway to extract and purify psilocybin from mushrooms that still meet the quality control standards that are required by clinical research and clinical application. There's quite a lot of work going also into development of psilocybin production through other biosynthetic techniques. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of interest in this field. So for the time being, I have to say that synthetic psilocybin seems to achieve the results in psychotherapy that we would hope in terms of the treatment of the mental health conditions that I mentioned earlier. But of course, there is definitely scope to explore the potential benefits of biologically produced psilocybin as well. And sooner or later, I guess we'll be in a position to compare the outcomes of synthetic versus biologically produced psilocybin. So the modes of action of psilocybin are very interesting, as they are with most of the classic psychedelics. We know that they all act quite potently at a group of serotonin receptors in our brains. Essentially, they are the serotonin 5-HT2A and 2C receptors, excuse me, along with the 5-HT1A receptor. And there's a variation in the effectiveness or the I guess the binding of each of these compounds to each of those three serotonin receptor subtypes, which seem to result in slightly different effects, slightly different experiential effects, and potentially different therapeutic effects. Psilocybin seems to hit the sweet spot in that it's primarily acting at the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. There's a couple of models of activity for psilocybin. The first one is the neurobiological model, which starts off with the physiological effects, mainly centering potentially on the regeneration of neurons, or the connections between neurons in our brains, which in some mental health conditions appear to be downregulated or reduced. And so related to those are a couple of other effects, which essentially all enhance the interconnections between our neurons, our brain cells, which are responsible for so many, essentially responsible for all of the effects that are occurring physiologically, psychologically as well. Now, functionally, the classic psychedelics, psilocybin included, mainly center on the modulation of brain networks, including the downregulation of the default mode network, which is a network of brain regions which generally appear to be related to our sort of sense of self-narrative, our sense of self. And in many cases, for example, particularly in depression and anxiety, they appear to be upregulated. In other words, their activity is enhanced, and so people can end up sort of focusing too much on their own problems, their own personal issues. Psilocybin, along with other psychedelics, appears to downregulate that and improve the capacity for us to reset and to review our own lives, our situations, and our problems in a new light. From the point of view of psychotherapy, then the relevant models are that the altered states of consciousness that are associated with the classical psychedelics, they address rigidified thought patterns, and they reintroduce novelty, sort of new ways of looking at the problems that we face. Most of us face every day of our lives, but in some cases, people seem to fixate too much on those particular problems. Another aspect of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy is that psilocybin and other classic psychedelics increase what we call suggestibility, which is the amenability to benefit from psychotherapeutic support. In some cases, that can go too far, but in general, if the psychotherapy is appropriate and well judged, then that kind of support can really assist people who have mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, and the other conditions that I mentioned above, can benefit dramatically from the intervention. Now, here in Australia, we really have we've moved a long way in a short time. So historically, there was not a lot going on in Australia prior to us knocking on the door in 2011. That's when PRISM evolved out of EGA. PRISM being Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, which is a charity basically focused on supporting and communicating the results of psychedelic mental health research. The real breakthrough came in the end of 2017 with the EGA conference. And there was a rapid shift occurring in Australia that occurred very close to the major shift in global awareness, primarily through media attention and communication of early research results. In Australia, we caught on fairly quickly, and I'm happy to say that I think we had a fairly significant part to play in that through communicating the global research results as well as the potential for psychedelics. And so really the first major step in that direction was the St Vincent's palliative care trial for anxiety and depression associated with terminal illness, which was planned through the course of 2018 to 19 and commenced in 2020. 2020 and 21 saw major progress, including the announcement of an Australian government funding round through the Medical Research Future Fund. And that really was a huge step forward because it was one of the very first indications of public sector support globally, in fact, for psychedelic medical research. So we're very happy to see that happening in Australia. And so hence we've seen around 9 new psychedelic medical research projects in the planning stages now, which will come about over the next 2 to 3 years. And it's really exciting to see Australia taking a position at the global table for psychedelic medical research. This year, 2022, and the next 2 to 3 years will, I think, really be the proliferation phase of psychedelic medical research. When we see these planned studies start to come into being, they'll be recruiting participants, and they will be addressing some of the significant mental health research questions, which are still plaguing all of us essentially in Australia and overseas. And from 2023 onwards, I think we'll see the consolidation phase. So that research will continue, it'll come to conclusion, and we'll be able to communicate the results of research alongside the major psychedelic research groups around the world. And so we'll really be making a significant contribution, primarily because Australia has such an incredibly strong medical research community. We have a huge skill base. We are welcoming people from around the world who are all able to communicate, to contribute to our local Australian research. And we can take our place, as I said, at the global table in terms of communicating our research results, making a contribution to eventually the translation of that research into clinical practice. So specifically, the current research activity in Australia, including studies at the planning stage, as I mentioned before, the St Vincent's Melbourne palliative care trial of psilocybin-assisted therapy for anxiety, depression associated with terminal illness. There's a study that I'm quite closely associated with now, which is at Monash University, and that is in a healthy population, but it's a neuroimaging study to look at the effects of a moderate dose of psilocybin in healthy participants in association with some extra sort of, lifestyle interventions, which potentially could have an impact on people's mental health in a positive, preventative sense, I guess. We're looking at preventative mental health rather than curative mental health. And I think this is a very interesting dimension or a direction that we should be adopting. There's a research study just about to commence at Swinburne University studying psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression. That's a proof of concept study. And then, of course, there's a St Vincent's Hospital Sydney study that's about to start for treatment of methamphetamine use disorder. So there is this sort of extra sort of crossover of psilocybin-assisted therapy into the treatment of other mental health conditions, which do seem to involve rather rigid sort of forms of thinking, and substance use disorder, including methamphetamine use disorder, do fall into that category. So federally funded studies which are about to sort of fire up over the next 2 to 3 years include a new study at Monash University for treatment-resistant depression. An interesting study at Austin Hospital in Melbourne for functional neurological disorder, which is more of a disorder associated with the potential sort of psychosomatic effects of that manifest in paralysis or other sort of physiological outcomes. There's an interesting preclinical trial at Monash of psilocybin for anorexia nervosa in a rodent model, as it happens, an animal model. All of these studies are happening in the public research sector, but we're also aware of significant developments in privately funded research in Australia, which nonetheless I think is likely to take place through collaboration with public institutions. So nonetheless, we're seeing a public dimension to all of this research in Australia. A couple of examples of that are the Monash University study of psilocybin-assisted therapy for generalised anxiety disorder. And there's a possible microdosing study of psilocybin coming up at another university in Australia very soon. So the major considerations, as I see them moving forward, are how does Australia contribute best to the global research effort? There's most people would be aware there's a hell of a lot of research underway now, and there's a lot more to come. It's very exciting. There's never been a more exciting time, I think, in psychedelic research. But of course, we do need to take care of how this research enterprise moves forward. But look, we have incredible Australian research skills, and the question is, how do we utilise them most effectively, most cost effectively? And so the public sector funding is very important, but I think there is lots of scope for a collaboration between the public and the private sectors. Ultimately, we're looking for novel approaches to the treatment of mental health conditions because many people, if not most people, agree that there's been a long period of a lack of development of effective treatments for psychological conditions. And so novelty really is the major underpinning sort of factor here. We have plenty of scope in Australia because we are so well across so many mental health conditions. But of course, we're all waiting for these new treatments to become apparent, and psychedelic-assisted therapies really seem to show a lot of promise in this regard. However, of course, there are some concerns which I have and a lot of other people share. There's a concern about over-enthusiasm, even evangelism of the merits of psychedelic-assisted therapies for mental health conditions. And there's a potential that many people may ultimately be disappointed by a lack of efficacy if these treatments are not appropriately applied and translated into clinical practice. There's a full range at this stage, unfortunately, of unsubstantiated claims for the treatment of mental health conditions, and we need to be very careful, as I said, about this over-enthusiasm. A lot of people have concerns and reservations about perhaps the over-medicalisation, in other words, the incorporation of psychedelic therapies into the contemporary Western medical model. And that's a very valid concern. I think we really need to engage in that conversation, personally, privately, and publicly, to ensure that we can achieve the best outcomes, and finding the right balance between appropriate medicalisation, but of course appropriate respect for the merits, for the great benefits of psychedelics, potentially in the non-clinical sense as well. Stepping beyond that, of course, we have concerns about over-corporatisation, and that slips into questions of intellectual property, patent law, and so on and so forth. And we don't have time to get into that right now, but of course, many people would be aware of the implications of that. Personally, and through PRISM, our organisation, we're very much committed to open science and the sharing of research results for the broad benefit of humankind. On the other hand, of course, we have the potential for over-regulation if government takes a too heavy a hand in all of this. But on the other hand, of course, we have the concern about under-regulation, which has implications, as we're seeing in poor practice, in poor clinical practice in various parts of the world, particularly at the moment in the research sector, but that could extend to issues following translation from research into clinical practice. So lots of questions to answer, lots of aspects to consider, but I would suggest to you that there's a lot of promise, and I think it's great that Australia is really on board at the moment and I encourage you to support in any way you can. So just very briefly, I'd like to acknowledge all of the people who have been involved in this process today. So all of the researchers and clinicians who have gone before us for over 50, 60 years now. So we have a long history prior to where we are now. And of course, we owe a great debt of gratitude to all of those people who have put their hard work into it in the past. In the more immediate sort of sense, of course, I'd like to acknowledge the colleagues at EGA, Entheogenesis Australis, and PRISM, Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine. We have a great team, and I think we've made tremendous progress in the last 10, 15, even 20 years. And we have a fantastic future ahead of us. I'd like to acknowledge the core researchers in the initial Australian studies, particularly the St Vincent's Hospital Melbourne team, who really have pioneered this area and really staked Australia's place in the global research sort of field. But of course, I'd like to acknowledge the emerging contributors to Australian psychedelic research. This is a rapidly expanding community. I'd like to encourage everybody who's listening to support. I'd like to encourage anybody who's involved in research just to go right ahead and really bring this about in Australia. The funding partners, especially the philanthropic funders of local research, as well as the government research support sort of networks, are really making a huge difference to our potential in Australia. Global collaborators, of course, are very, very important, and we have an expanding network of those. And of course, finally, anybody who has an interest in this field and who supports us in any way, from financial contributions to broadening awareness of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic culture. So thank you all for your involvement, for your interest, and for being with us this evening. Cheers.
And thank you also to yourself, Dr. Martin Williams. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done over the past decade with PRISM and much longer beforehand, because I know that EGA is going on 20 years as well, and EGA really has been a seeding organisation, creating and helping to facilitate a lot of those networks and to help create organisations like PRISM. So thank you very much, Martin, as well. Before we go on to our next talk, and we will be doing a Q&A soon, so make sure to keep dropping those questions in, and thank you to everyone who has done so far. Just Martin mentioned discussion about the emerging sort of psychedelic industries, and there's a really great podcast that I'll give a quick plug to. The podcast is the Cover Story New York Magazine Power Trip podcast. Really good look into psychedelic research all around the world. It's an American podcast, so obviously a focus on the American, but they really do have a global focus, and some of those involved with it are friends of EGA as well. And a personal favourite podcast of mine is Team Human, which is with Douglas Rushkoff. Rushkoff has been involved with the psychedelic scene since the late 80s, or since the mid 80s, when it was sort of the technomad rave subcultures and DIY anarchist aesthetic, putting together sound systems and new ways of creating community. And since then, Rushkoff has been recognised. I believe I saw he was number 6 on MIT's most influential thinkers in the world, and he does this fantastic podcast, which really helped me personally through a lot of the pandemic to have a voice of reason in there. And he recently had on friends of EGA, Nashay Devenot and David Nichols, speaking about, again, some of those issues that are perhaps a little less discussed with the psychedelic renaissance, because I think that's one of those pitfalls that we in particular try to make sure that we don't fall down, is becoming evangelists who forget to ask the important questions, who don't want to self-analyze, because we have been in a position of prohibition for so long where when you finally get some ground, you want to keep pushing, and you don't want to necessarily go have something that sets you back a little bit. But that's where that's where the real work occurs, in admitting where there might be things that aren't going quite right, and that's where real science is, in finding those faults and finding those things that aren't quite going right as well. So I'll drop those links into the chat, but just wanted to mention those because I think that was something that Martin sort of alluded to. Our next speaker is Simon Beck, myco-enthusiast for over 10 years, with over 10 years of experience foraging and eating many different species of fungi on Australia's east coast. Simon enjoys targeting new species and seeking out new locations for hunting. He has a particular interest in psilocybe and other psychoactive species, and I'm just throwing in different pronunciations there because it's still not in my head right. And it helps run the PMANS group on Facebook, which is Psychedelic Mushrooms Australia and New Zealand, I think. So that's a Z at the end, PMANS. He has previously guided educational groups in the field, teaching others the basic of fungus identification, and plans to continue to do so in the future. Simon's academic background is in medicine and psychiatry, and I'll introduce Simon now.
Hey, g'day. My name's Simon. Ronnie from EGA's asked me to come and have a bit of a chat about psychedelic mushroom harm reduction pointers. I have a background in medicine and mental health, and also have been a mushroom identifier and forager for quite a few years now. So I just thought I'd give a really brief rundown of some of the things that I think about when I think about harm reduction around psychedelic mushrooms. And the first thing to start with is to make sure that you are taking the correct species, that the mushroom you are taking is the one that you thought you were taking. There's quite a few different psychoactive species that grow in different parts of Australia, and there's a lot of overlap between those areas. Right up in southeast Queensland, you can get the cold weather woodlover subaeruginosa and the warm weather dung-loving cubensis growing at the same time. So it is really important to know that you have the correct species, both in terms of the psychoactive mushroom that you think you're taking, but also making sure that it is actually one of those mushrooms. There are poisonous lookalikes that grow in really similar habitats. Gallerinas are often found in the same clusters as the wood-loving Psilocybin subaeruginosis. So do be mindful of that, learn your ID features, and learn how to specifically identify the toxic lookalikes that grow in your area alongside the species you're picking. It is probably a bigger concern with the wood-loving subaeruginosa than it is with the dung-loving species. There are fewer possible toxic lookalikes that grow in the dung in the warm weather. Confirm your IDs. There are loads of really useful online resources. EGA's put a bunch of great ones out. Kane Barlow has a bunch of really good ones for most of the common Australian species. So learn your ID and confirm it against those, but also reach out to some of the online communities. There's a bunch of really good Facebook groups now and some Discord chats, including PMANs that you can go to post photos and get some confirmation on your ID from people who have some experience identifying these things. And if you are buying psilocybin mushrooms, just be mindful of what you're buying, both in terms of knowing which species you're buying. Cultivated cubensis are commonly sold, but then so are the subaeruginosa, especially in the areas where they do grow in large numbers. So double check what species you're buying and make sure that if you are buying them, you're getting it from someone that you trust to know what they're talking about, trust to know what the mushroom they're giving you actually is before you go about consuming it. It's a lot harder to identify dried mushrooms than it is fresh ones. So just be mindful of that as well. It may sometimes be quite difficult to get confirmation on what you've been told if you've been sold dry mushrooms in terms of what they actually are. The second thing, along with making sure you've got the right mushroom, is to make sure that you're taking the correct dose. That is the correct dose for the species, because there's a huge variation in potency and dose between the common species that grow in Australia. Cubensis, the dose can be 1.5 times or up to double the dose of subaeruginosa. So it's important to know the dose for the specific species that you're actually planning to ingest. Know as well that dry weights versus fresh weights vary a lot for mushrooms. For subaeruginosa and cubensis, they probably lose about 90% of their weight when they are dried. So usually the wet weight will be tenfold the dry weight roughly, but that can vary in just individual mushroom to mushroom and species to species as well. So just bear that in mind and do your research around the dose of the mushroom you're looking at. Make sure it's the right dose for the situation, and that includes making sure that it's the right dose for the intention that you've set. 5 grams of cubensis is probably for most people going to be a bit beyond a light, pro-social dose. So just, tailor the dose to your intended experience. There's a bunch of online resources that can help you, get a rough idea of the dose of that species that will deliver a certain level of experience, but also obviously everyone is a little different and it can even change, to some extent over time. So if in doubt, start slow. It's probably usually better to undershoot than overshoot for most people. And don't feel pressured to take heroic doses. It's unnecessary and it's not for everyone. So, over time, just figure out what's right for you in different situations. When you get a new batch, even if it's the same species of mushroom, it's worth starting a bit slow with that again as well, just because you never know how potent that particular batch is going to be. Mushrooms can vary massively, potency specimen to specimen, even from the same patch, even from the same flushing, which makes it really important if you're getting a new batch of mushrooms to start lower again, just to feel them out. And it's usually a good idea if you can to homogenize your batches of mushroom as well. So if you have more than one dose collected, to dry them all and powder them, or find some other way of combining them into a tea or something that can then be metered out. That way you can get familiar with that batch, and it also evens out the difference that exists between specimen to specimen in terms of one can be really, really potent and the next one can be significantly weaker. So it evens that out a little bit and makes dosing a lot more reliable when you're doing it by weight than by the number of mushrooms, or if you're just weighing whole individual specimens of mushrooms. Because for something like Subaeruginosa, a handful of mushrooms might by weight be an adequate dose, but if all of those mushrooms in your hand are particularly strong specimens, then you can be way beyond the mark that you may have been aiming for based on the weight. Be mindful of your set and setting. Make sure that you have a safe place for the entire duration of the experience, and however long you may need afterwards to relax, chill out, process, integrate, and make sure that you can get comfortable. Again, be mindful of how you actually feel. Is this the right time to be engaging in this experience? Is this the right place to be engaging in this experience? What's your intention for that experience on this occasion? And is this the right situation for that, both internally and externally? Consider who else is around. What are they doing? What are their plans? Are they also engaging in a psychedelic experience, or do they have some other plans? How comfortable are you with the other people that are there? Because it's important that you don't feel or aren't vulnerable at any point. And is there a trip sitter, somebody who's going to stay with you and look after you, mind you, hold that space for you to make sure that you are safe? And if there's not actually going to be physically someone there to fill that role, is there somebody that you've pre-arranged with that you can contact, that will be available for you to contact at any point during the experience should you need some assistance or some support? That can be another way that you can have somebody around without necessarily having them in the room with you. And it's just something that you pre-arrange in advance and sort of say, look, up until this hour tonight, can you please make sure that you're available with your phone in case I need to call you for something? You might even arrange that they check in at some point during the experience. Up to you to feel that out. Consider a plan for any sort of potential foreseeable interruptions and emergencies. And I say that not to encourage you to catastrophize and think through the worst possible situation immediately before engaging in one of these experiences, because that can shift the mood a little bit negatively as well. But Preparation for a lot of people can actually, reduce the experience of anxiety that might come up with uncertainty during the experience. And on a practical level, having some, basic idea of an emergency plan is just important. It's good common sense. So, especially if you're outdoors or in an isolated environment, just having some really basic practical idea of what would I do if I needed to get in touch with emergency services. Do you have mobile phone reception? Is there somebody there that can drive a car safely to get you where you would need to be in that sort of situation? So having some plan for those things is both just, basic safety, but also can reduce the anxiety that might pop up if you start to worry about some of those things during the experience. And engaging in sort of childlike playful play can be a really important and rewarding aspect of these experiences for some people, but there is a difference between being playful and being reckless, and I think it's important to bear that in mind. For all the anecdotes about climbing up an oak tree or whatever in the middle of a thunderstorm, and enjoying your psychedelic experience up there, it's obviously a pretty dangerous thing to go and start doing that sort of stuff while you are taking psychedelics. So it's probably better to be playful but not reckless, and to try and bear that in mind during the experience, and definitely no driving during a psychedelic experience. And look out for each other. Learn some mental health first aid and some trip sitting skills. There's a bunch of really good resources around for those specific skills as they relate to psychedelic harm reduction and care. And I think everyone should just do their basic first aid training so that you all have, some idea of how to provide some basic care to people if they need it. Consider in advance your aftercare and your integration plan. How are you going to engage with the effects of the experience wearing off? What are you planning to do immediately after the experience? Who's going to be around for that? And then a more medium and longer term plan for how you might go about integrating the meaning of the experience, if that's part of the intention that you set for that experience as well, and also how to integrate and who you could turn to for integration if a difficult experience presents itself and you find that that's something you need to actively focus on integrating a little bit more afterwards. I also just want to talk really quickly about woodlovers paralysis. This is something that I'm particularly interested in, and Kane Barlow and myself have done a survey of this, and we've talked about the results for EGA before if you wanted to go and have a look at that video. It's harm reduction for this involves a lot of what I've already said about, having a trip sitter, being mindful of the dose, being mindful of going slow with a new batch of mushrooms, especially if it is from a new patch, and making sure that you're in a safe environment when you do take psychedelic mushrooms, particularly the woodlovers that can cause woodlovers paralysis. But there are some extra safety points around this as well, and that is that this syndrome seems reasonably uncommon but common enough to be mindful of with the psilocybin aeruginosa that grow really widely in the southern half of the country during the colder months, growing on wood. Woodlovers paralysis syndrome of muscle paralysis that can occur sporadically after taking these species of mushroom, can affect different parts of the body, can shift around the body, and can come on and off in waves. It's often worse when you are trying to use a muscle, which can obviously be problematic when you're trying to do something like chew or walk, or use your hands for anything meaningful. So be mindful that it does present those extra risks. If you are somewhere where it is going to be dangerous for you to lose the use of your legs for any period of time, like outside in the cold, camping, walking along a road or trying to cross a road, be mindful that you may end up on the ground there and not be able to get up. So I think the first time that you're trying a new batch of these wood-loving mushrooms, from the perspective of woodlovers paralysis, it's probably really important to do that in a really safe environment. Be extra mindful of the potential risks associated with the sudden loss of the use of some of your important muscle functions. And in terms of how specifically people are affected by this, I do recommend you go and have a look at that video so that you can be familiar with it. It's not something to be, terrified of. I'm not trying to sort of provoke unnecessary anxiety around it, but it is something that does happen, and it is something that you might be faced with one day. So I think it's important to have some understanding of how it usually presents, how it usually comes on, when it usually wears off, and particularly being mindful that it can actually first come on way after the psychedelic experience has actually ended. So it wasn't all that uncommon in our survey for people to first notice the weakness the day after the experience, and some people had some pretty profound impairments as a result of the weakness even the day after the dose. So again, also make sure that you have prepared time-wise to have at least a day after the experience off, particularly if you're trying a new batch of wood-loving mushrooms. And I do think it is more likely to occur if you're taking the same batch that has caused the weakness or the paralysis previously as well. In terms of first aid, there isn't an awful lot of specific stuff to mention. Just stay warm, rest if you are affected by the weakness, rest the muscles, and be mindful that it may well come on suddenly again, even after it's seemingly gone away. So it's really common for people to get weakness of the legs that stops them from being able to walk, and then they go to stand up again 20 minutes later, half an hour later, when they feel like the strength has come back, only to find that as soon as they try and walk again, the weakness comes back and they fall over. So just be mindful that it has that pattern as well. Be mindful of the possible side effects of the old antihistamines if you are intending to try and use those to manage wood lovers paralysis. I'm not sure that there's a good reason to recommend that widely, but I'm also not here to give any specific medical advice. But I think it's worth, looking into that and giving it some consideration about whether it's worth the possible side effects of some of those older sedating antihistamines for, what some have anecdotally touted might help with paralysis. And call for help if you get concerned. I think it is important that if you or someone you're with is really badly affected by this, that they have their breathing monitored. If this can affect all of the other skeletal muscles, there is the at least theoretical possibility that it may affect the muscles of respiration and impair your breathing at some point, or in some situation in combination with other drugs that can do that, or a health problem, or who really knows what else at this stage. We're just not sure. And a lot of people in our survey did report some subjective difficulty with breathing during this experience. So it is important that if somebody is having really bad wood lovers paralysis, you monitor that they are breathing appropriately. Look out for any signs of sedation, lethargy, blueness in the face, pallor, getting pale, getting breathless. And I think it's always better to call for help early if you have major concerns, and apply your basic first aid as well. So making sure that if somebody is having difficulty breathing, they're in the recovery position and being monitored as well. So that's my little talk about psychedelic mushroom harm reduction, and I hope that's really helpful. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help answer them, and enjoy.
And thank you very much to Simon there for talking to us about some of the murkier sides, or the important sides to remember if you are looking at exploring psilocybin. I can also recommend the resources from Dancewise, part of Harm Reduction Victoria's party harm reduction response. And you can find the magic mushroom or psilocybin resource at that website, and I'll drop a link in there. It's been redesigned recently. Looks very pretty, and it's a really good, very basic summary of some of the things to look out for in harm reduction on psilocybin, and very nice printed out. You can also order those at the Harm Reduction Victoria website, so I'll put that up in just a tick. We are doing our Q&A now, so thank you to everyone who has stayed tuned for this marathon mushroom broadcast tonight, Microdose Webcast 15. Kane and Martin are here with me live, and we are going to take some of your questions now. Our first question, is it unsafe to try microdosing while on antidepressants, particularly tetracyclic antidepressants?
I'll take that one. I think microdosing is still a new relatively new sort of field, and I think we have a long way to go before we really understand the ins and outs of that. But what I can say is that at this particular point, we would feel that the doses of psychedelics that are involved in microdosing are probably not going to cause any particular problems in association with tetracyclic, tricyclic, or SSRI antidepressants. So at this stage, I would counsel people to get solid medical advice, because I'm not a medical practitioner, but nonetheless, I think it's important to state that microdosing is still a relatively untested area of psychedelic research. We don't really have a full understanding, but the doses involved are most unlikely to interact or interfere with antidepressants overall.
And our next question, and do keep those questions coming in the comments section about anything that has been discussed tonight, and we'll endeavour to answer that for you. Can you explain what is happening when even a dose of 6 grams of dried mushrooms does not produce a psychedelic experience? And before either of you get to it, I'll just say there's a couple of things that I can think of off the top of my head, and that's inactive or low active mushrooms. So if they're dried mushrooms, if they've been stored poorly, psilocybin can break down very easily, so it's possible that they have been stored poorly, and the psilocybin amount is just very lacking in that sample. And I know that there are also some contraindications, but Martin or Kane?
I can probably throw a point in there, maybe before Kane hops in as well. Certainly, Nick, you mentioned the most obvious potential sort of reason or factor in that poor storage, or essentially degradation of psilocybin in the biological material has resulted in a lack of effect. But there's a couple of physiological responses, or lack of, that might be implicated. One that comes to mind is that because psilocybin from mushroom source is dephosphorylated to form psilocin, which is actually the active compound which can cross the barrier between the bloodstream and our brains, that dephosphorylation step may be somehow diminished in certain people due to certain medical conditions, through certain drug interactions, through possibly alcohol use or over alcohol use. There's a number of things which might come into play. And so essentially our bodies are not working quite the way that we would normally expect them to do in terms of metabolizing and incorporating psilocybin, and hence having a psychoactive or psychotropic effect. There's also the possibility that the clearance mechanisms in our bodies, which are responsible for the removal of psilocybin and the psilocybin metabolites, psilocin, are slightly overactive in certain people. And so there's a possibility that our enzymatic processes are working too effectively, too well. And so the effective dose of the psilocin in our bloodstream, and hence moving into our brains, may be diminished by an overactivity of those clearance mechanisms. And there are a few other sort of aspects which may be coming into play. Remember also that 6 grams dried is clearly, most people would regard as being a fairly solid and potentially extremely effective dose. So I would be inclined to say that something's not quite right there, probably more in the material rather than our bodily processes themselves. Okay, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that would have been my thought as well, was probably more likely the material. It's either just been stored really badly and the tryptamines have just degraded, or it was just a really low alkaloid group of mushrooms in the first place. Like some Severigonosa, for example, don't produce a whole lot of psilocybin or psilocin.
And I suppose further to that question in the comment section from Kate asking best way to store mushrooms for longevity with there's a couple of responses that have been thrown in already, which is airtight container in the back of your freezer or most cool dark places. Any more advice? I think those, is it called desiccant?
Yeah, desiccant. Yep.
Yeah, those the little.
You can buy that in hardware stores fairly easily. I know of people who've made teas, for example, and then just frozen ice cubes of tea. Seems to be a good long-term storage.
Yep. One thing I would add is make sure if you are storing something that it is as dry as possible. Any moisture in there, and you can get fungi growing on your fungi, which is not a fun time. That's where you get all sorts of adulterants, and you don't want that. You just have to throw away anything that's been a little bit moist. Because
lots of people will also recommend honey for a long-term storage, but if you do that, do be careful. Make sure you read a text that's nice and detailed on how to do it. You want the mushrooms very, very dry. Like cracker dry, I think is the term used. You don't want any moisture added, and you do need to be careful that there's not any bacterial growth afterwards. The bacteria will also happily grow within the honey.
Stephen's just added in the chat as well that his partner, it takes a long time for the come up to happen. So just be aware not to redose too quickly, just in case you end up double dosing and having a much more extreme or intense experience than you're expecting. It's always best to start low and go slow, and just especially if you're trying if it's a new sample that you haven't tried before, you're not aware of how strong it could be, because there are definitely reports out there of very strong experiences from very small amounts of mushrooms, and then very, as we've just heard, very light or no experience from what seems like a large amount of mushrooms. So it's really, you're dealing with samples from nature, and that goes to one of the things that Martin was talking about in why a lot of the research is using synthetic psilocybin, and that's partly as a control. Although there are also ways to determine how much psilocybin is in things. Thank you for the comments and questions so far. If you do have, I
will add to that too. Yep. The whole truffle thing. If you come across philosopher's stones, they are slow to break down in your gut, and for the psilocybin to be released. At which point, yes, you do tend to maybe want a double dose. So do be careful. You do need to wait longer.
Next question, and this is an interesting one on some of the things that we were talking about in terms of the ethics of the psychedelic renaissance. And the question was just simply how to reduce harm caused by psychedelic organisations. But I think there's maybe a little bit of a broader discussion there. We have a diverse and a growing number of organisations and individuals entering the psychedelic space, especially over the past 5 years. It's grown a lot over the past, this century. It's grown a lot, and a lot of new players entering the field, especially for-profit organisations which are looking to sell things like information on tripping, information on microdosing, information on growing, all sorts of things. And I'll just add a caveat that, remember, psilocybin is still a prohibited substance in Victoria and across Australia, and although the numbers are low, there are a small number of people every year who do receive criminal charges for the possession or use of psilocybin, and there are some horror stories out there as well in terms of the legal response. So that that's always something to keep in mind. But harm caused by psychedelic organisations. Does somebody want to approach that? Maybe.
Look, I would just begin by looking at, does that organisation have an ethics statement? What is their public intentions, I guess.
Yep. So discussion around ethics is important. Yep. what about structures of organisations? There are a wide variety of structures available to form an organisation, ranging from business to non-profit. Are there things that we should be looking out for? Or perhaps, if an organisation is a certain kind of structure, are there ways that we ourselves can sort of probe that organisation and see what they're, how they're operating, what sorts of operating principles they have?
I guess my feeling is that I hate to patronise, but I think it really comes down to a question of maturity, and maturity sort of comes into play with organisations as well as individuals, and I think one demonstrated effect of early psychedelic experiences is a sort of a real sort of wow, gee whiz, sort of holy crike sort of response, and that can extend to people who are running organisations as well. Eventually.
Oop. We've just lost Martin by the looks of it.
I think we lost Martin.
Are you there, Martin?
Experiences, or it might be a lot of it. And so, I think it's a matter of people taking time to take stock of. Can you hear me all right? Sorry?
Yeah, sorry, we can now. You just dropped out for a little bit in the middle there.
Yeah, sorry, strange. All right. So really it's a matter of sort of taking a deep breath and working out why we're here, what we're hoping to achieve, and remember that we are a community. We're humanity, and there are certain people, certain organisations who can be very polarising and divisive, and I think maybe they don't really have a full understanding of what psychedelics are about and what the community is all about.
Yeah, I myself come from a strong sort of not-for-profit and community organisation background. I've sat on various boards of community organisations and have always approached the psychedelic space with that ethos. And I think it's something important to see that people are, or organisations are, community-minded, that they're looking to find the others and help boost each other, rather than something that really irks me personally, and I'm sure a lot of people share this view. When you get an organisation which is clearly, or an individual, which are clearly looking to boost their own profile at the expense of others, and they're not looking to help boost everybody. They're not looking to continue the conversation unless it's on their terms, and I think that sets dangerous precedents, because it means that we're not really having a community conversation. We're having a conversation based on X organisation or X individual, and I just don't think it shows goodwill towards the work, the decades of work that so many, and decades of experience that so many have as well. So that's something that I think is good to watch out for.
Nick, could I just say something very quickly? I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to leave. But interestingly enough, we've got a Zoom meeting on hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, and so I'm actually going to have to hop out of this chat, but into something that's very interesting and closely related. So perhaps I could leave this panel with a question. What do you think the future is on, or what do you think the prospects are for exploring HPPD or flashback phenomena? Is there any scope to explore that further? I'm sorry I have to leave, but thank you so much for having me involved this evening.
Thank you very much for your input tonight, Martin, and a good one to leave us on. There is it's an interesting area. So HPPD, or hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder.
Perception disorder.
Is sort of over the past decade, I've sort of followed a little bit of the literature, and there's very little out there on it. Thank you, Martin. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And we'll switch over here, and I'll get rid of our names because that's the wrong names. How do we do it? There we go. And I'll make you a little bit bigger in a tick. But I'll just say, yes, HPPD. The sort of the common name for it, I guess, is flashbacks. People who are experiencing either a flashback of something that happened in the experience itself, or a flashback of the phenomena that were experienced in the experience itself. So it's something that people often report report on the forums, and it's hard to sort of quantify, I guess, because one of the things that I ask myself, because it's based on perception, it's hard in the first place because you have to look at sort of qualitative data, and it's phenomenological data as well. You're talking about the phenomena that people are experiencing personally. You can't really go into their experience and probe it, because you just have to rely on how they're reporting it. And I know, like, to me, I've sort of wondered, hang on, is that just what a memory is? But I have read some reports from people, especially around their vision, and reporting sort of a static overlay, like there's a strange sort of staticness to their vision, or they'll go back in and start to feel the trip coming on again. And this is also separate to other psychological or psychiatric disorders that people might have. So you can cut those out, and it just seems to be a sort of perceptual, visual, especially visual phenomena. There's not a lot of research out there, but there are some particularly passionate people out there because they have either experienced it or have loved ones that experienced it, and want to know what's going on. Kane, have you got an insight on HPPD?
No, I don't actually. It's not a topic I can really speak to. I mean, I would probably have my own alternate question, though, about ASMR, and how maybe that relates to psychedelics.
Oh, do you want to touch on that? ASMR being auto simp. Yeah, you fill in the gaps for me.
Meridian response.
ASMR, Meridian, yep. So that's when people, there's things like getting goosebumps when you're listening to your favourite music, and things like that.
Goosebumps. It's kind of starts out as a really interesting kind of sensation in your scalp, and then starts to travel down your spine. And it's something that I've felt on psychedelics many, many times. For me, and even kind of smelling psilocybin-containing mushrooms does that for me. It triggers a particular response in my body. But yeah, no, it can be triggered by a variety of different sounds or even thoughts, or seeing particular emotions expressed in films, for example.
Another question in the chat, and unless there's not too many more questions, we'll wrap up soon. So if you do have any final questions, comments, do drop them in there. This one, Liam, what is the redose window with mushrooms? How long before the tolerance takes hold?
I think there's two aspects to that. There's the actual physiological aspect of your physiological tolerance. I think the general window is between, say, 3 to 4 days to a week before redosing is kind of the acceptable period. Any less than that, and you're probably not going to get the full effect of the compound that you're taking, be it LSD or psilocybin. But then there's also another aspect, which is, I guess, questioning why you're taking a dose again so soon. And perhaps you actually need to take some time to integrate the experience that you had, and take some time out before you redose. I think there tends to be, if you're tripping a lot in a short period of time, you're not integrating those experiences and maybe making the most of the experience itself.
Yeah, I have certainly heard on my harm reduction path over the past decade, I've heard amazing life-changing experience stories, and I have both heard and seen some pretty dark things happen as well, where it might be relating to somebody's set and setting, but especially that sort of hidden part of your set, which is not just where you are, but where you are internally, where your mind is at, where your life is at, where whatever it is that's going on in your life is at. I have seen personally some really difficult scenarios where people have. Their explanation afterwards was that they just felt like they were circling the void. They couldn't see. They just felt like they were entering into darkness. And then physically, they have expressed that by doing things that were dangerous to themselves, potentially others, not directed. So there's difference, I think, between aggression that is directed towards somebody and a sort of chaotic physical state where people are just getting up. They're not really taking into account their space. They might be running into walls, doors, heaters, just getting into dangerous situations. And this is why it's really important to be knowledgeable about harm reduction as well. If you are tripping with other people, it's important that you are across some basic harm reduction and have an ability to deal with those. Because I think if you're exploring the psychedelic world, be prepared. It's not always rainbows and sparkles. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because life is not always rainbows and sparkles. And I often used to have friends who would ask me when I was much younger, "Oh, did you have a good time, on mushrooms?" And I'd be like, "Don't know if that's the way you put it. Like, do you have a good time?" Like reading a book, like it's ups and downs, you're enjoying reading the book, but the story that you're going into, there might be sad parts, there might be devastating parts, there might be scary parts. It's more like that, I think.
You definitely need to expect a journey, an internal journey, and you have to be willing and ready to kind of accept what that journey is.
Exactly. Another question. Will there be any medicinal mushrooms in the future? I'm not sure what that's really quite asking. Will there be any medicinal mushrooms? And if there already are.
I agree. There already are. There's already
I'll ask, I don't know, which is the person there. If you want to elaborate on that question, we'll try and get to that. Is there a way to support new growth / cause little harm with the mycelium when picking? I think that's for you, Kane. A favourite question of our mushroom talks.
It is a favourite question. So pretty much straight up, there's evidence that shows that cutting and pulling, there's no real difference between the two. There's arguments for and arguments against. But with the pulling, if you want to minimise the damage to the mycelium, the best thing to do is just to hold the mushroom closely at the base of the stem, the stipe, and just to pull it very, very gently out of the ground.
And just further to our redosing question before, just to sort of contextualise, the question is about if you want to up your dose after you have already consumed and you're already feeling it and you're confident that you're at that space. Is there any parameters that you should be looking at if you want to try and up your dose?
Interesting question. So I think it depends on how much you've taken. I mean, if you've taken like a little bit and just to test the dose, I don't know. I guess it kind of depends on the parameters of what you're looking. Are you looking for a museum dose? Are you looking for a medium fun party dose or a heroic dose?
Well, I guess just on that, and I'm not sure because I have generally had in my head and in my own experience that tolerance does build fairly quickly. So if you do redose, it's possible that it will just do nothing. I'm not even sure if elongating the experience is something that you can really do. Sometimes perhaps the better option is to work out where you've got a sample where the experiences are at with certain amounts of that sample, and then try on at different times to have a larger or smaller dose based on your experience of previous ones. And that's where it can be useful to keep something like a trip diary or keep notes, not just for your integration purposes, but also to sort of keep notes on certain batches or samples as well.
Yeah. Look, but I think to answer the question, I think probably the general rule is, if you've taken a dose and after 3 to 4 hours you want to redose, you essentially have to double it.
Yep. And I'm not saying
Your tolerance kicks in really quick. Like it's pretty instantaneous.
And I'm not seeing any more questions or comments at this stage. So unless somebody wants to jump in quickly, we'll pretty much wrap it up. Kane, are there any final thoughts or comments that you want to leave us on before we wrap up and go to a couple more videos, and then we'll be hearing from you as well?
No, I don't have anything to wrap up with. No, I've got a whole other presentation to give yet. So,
well, we better get.
I'm going to wrap up there.
So thank you to everyone who has asked. Oh, wait, one more. Are there any particular gum tree species that act as good places for the substrate? This person hasn't found any subs under gum trees in native forests other than Pinus radiata, which I think is your common pine tree there.
Oh, okay. I mean, eucalyptus is pretty well expected to be their endemic substrate. They really like paths near the forest, and maybe you're looking too close within the forest. You could just kind of move out to paths around those eucalyptus. Look at the base of ferns, bracken ferns, like pteridium species, and look around grass. It's a good idea to get close to the ground and kind of move things around a little bit, because fungi do tend to hide sometimes in some environments.
Yeah, and on that as well, I think one thing that I've noticed over the years that I've been interested in mushrooms is that you'll get people who swear by these locations that are an hour and a half drive away, and lots of people know about them, and they'll go and make a pilgrimage of it, and like lovely to do, good to go out and support our regional towns across Victoria. Make sure to buy a pie from the local bakery while you're at it, and do things like that. But you don't need to go that far. There are definitely places all across inner Melbourne and across the suburbs. They are in council gardens. Speak to some people and you'll find, I mean, people are generally hesitant to share their own special locations, and I think that's a pretty sensible thing to do. Protect your locations as well. Make sure to look after where you're there. Don't leave empty cans of Woodstock, which I see sometimes. That's a bit feral. Just look after the environment that you're in. But yeah, you don't have to go far, so you might be able to find things far closer.
I'm going to jump in there. And just. I know people don't like me describing them like this, but they can be a very weedy species. They're very adventitious. So if you're out, looking for these, beautiful ornamental fungi, they grow in lots of urban environments. They're quite adventitious. They grow on wood chips. The spores get on shoes and they spread quite rapidly. So.
Especially wood chips that have been established for about a year, I find. Not your fresh wood chips, because the mycelium hasn't had a chance to grow in them. But it's also then, I guess, important to remember that rotting wood, rotting logs are not junk. They are places of growth. They are places of life, especially for mushrooms and bugs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, they're definitely, it's important to leave stuff in place, leave debris, leave logs where they are. You will see council workers out there cutting up logs and then just leaving them. So it's best that they're just left alone and not scavenged for fires in the park or whatever.
Thank you very much for all your questions tonight. If you do have more, keep dropping them in the comment section, because we're in there in the comment section and we can answer them by typing. We're going to go to our next video now. And Kane, thank you. We'll hear from you again shortly. And our next video comes from Let's find our Dr. Alastair McTaggart. Alastair is a research fellow at the Centre of Horticultural Science, QAAFI, at the University of Queensland. He studies the evolution of fungal pathogens with a focus on rust and smut fungi. He has completed postdocs in Africa, America and Europe. Alastair has started a new research direction for UQ, studying the biodiversity of native psychoactive mushrooms in Australia. This research will determine whether Australian magic mushrooms have evolved unique genetic pathways for production of psilocybin and confirm endemicity of our native taxa. Alastair will establish a living collection to safeguard genetic diversity and provide a platform to research the applications of psilocybin for human health. And we have heard from Alastair in previous EGA talks, and I'll get our moderators to drop the links to those talks into the comment section so you can put those, put them in your playlists, and make sure to watch those as well. But this is our latest update from Alastair.
Hey, Alastair here, and I'll just update you on the biodiversity of magic mushrooms in Australia with some of the new results of where Psilocybe cubensis might have come from, and some stuff on mating as usual, and just how the collection is going in general. Last week, I gave a talk for Queensland Health, this Q Health, and the Queensland Police Service on natural drugs and toxins in Australia. So it was a huge seminar day. I'm going to, if they share a link, it was recorded, I'll put it on the blog. And I recommend checking out one of the talks. There was a talk on DMT and the criminal use in Australia, especially illegal production, which I just found fascinating, and I think the community of Entheogenesis will find it pretty interesting too. So check it out if you've got a spare 10. Okay, and it's sub season, so gotta chuck up a few photos of subs. These ones were collected possibly in a new location for Queensland, in a national park, with park rangers and Indigenous rangers, and I was hoping the Indigenous rangers would know what they were, because it would make our job linking use of Psilocybe subaeruginosa with Indigenous people much easier. But I think we're going to have our work cut out for us, but I'm sure that we're up for it. Thanks to everyone who's been sending me photos of subs as well. I've just really enjoyed seeing the phenotypic variation from all across the East Coast. Wonderful. I just wanted to illustrate the spore rate, the spore drop, or how prolific cubes are when they're dropping spores. So this has just been here for 10 minutes and it's already left this massive load at the back of this paper here. So millions of spores, and then the same here just in this 10 minutes. I say that they drop at 2,000 per minute, and that's just extrapolating from knowledge of other Basidiomycota. We could probably measure it with a hemocytometer if the community desperately wanted to know how many spores were getting produced per minute. I've got the required equipment to do that. Let me know. While we're on spores, Psilocybe cubensis on the right, Psilocybe subaeruginosa on the left. So chalk and cheese. Kane's been sending me, these are from Queensland. Kane's been sending me some from Tasmania. And so these two really far apart populations, the spore morphology is unrecognizable. Mycologists often use spores. They fall back to spore differences when they're trying to differentiate species if there isn't any phenotypic variation in the mushroom itself. So these were pretty uniform from Queensland to Tasmania. Interesting. The collection so far, so cubes, the season's just come to an end. At the end of one season, I had over 50. Unfortunately, I had a little bit of a mite problem, so it's dropped back down to 48. But I'm not too worried. I think I can revisit the populations that I lost pretty easily. Thanks to people from Entheogenesis, Matt W, Bocky and Dan, Andy from Ballina. It's just been fantastic to receive samples of cubes from you, and you've really helped contribute to how wide across Australia we can do our sampling. I've sequenced 3 genomes, and 2 weeks ago I submitted 32 for more genomic sequencing, and this may be enough to resolve the genetic diversity of Psilocybe cubensis in Australia. I expect there to be low genetic diversity, and if there is low genetic diversity, then probably we don't need to keep sampling. Now, I've been wrong with every hypothesis I've ever made about psilocybe, so it's, who knows, there could be high genetic diversity, in which case we'd have to keep sampling. With Subaeruginosa, the season now, so thanks to Kane, thanks to Dave from Kosciuszko, we've got 3 populations from Queensland, plus more populations coming from Tassie, Victoria, and New South Wales. I expect we'll end up with probably more than 50 haploid cultures by the end of this season, and I'll do my best to get all those genomes sequenced before my contract finishes. Okay, I've put this up for a couple of reasons. I just am really mindful that phylogenetic trees are probably a little bit more intuitive to interpret, and that's just the way that Darwin had first illustrated them, the way he intended evolution, that dichotomous hypothesis with easy branching. These are splits trees, and in a splits tree, it's putting down every kind of way, different tips. So at the end of each of these little branches is a tip. Every way the data between those tips can be related to each other. So it's kind of the best of everything. This is the way you can visualize all the relationships among data. I love them. When you see reticulation, it's often a sign of recombination, sexual reproduction, or in this case, probably in the ITS region, it's like, oh, geez, it's a bit hard to explain this area. We don't know what exactly is going on. We know that cubes and subs at some point had a most recent common ancestor, along with this group, whatever this is under my dome. So what we see here, and you always hear me refer to subs as subs, even though there's heaps of names to apply to them, including more like Eucalypta australiana, tasmaniensis. I can't remember the names. In fact, I think I might have just said them wrong then. What we're doing in this study with all these genomes is finding structure. And structure is just whether different populations are having sex. So if they're not, then there's evidence that maybe they're separated from each other over time, whether it's because they're in a different geographical region, or there's a boundary like a flipping Bass Strait, or they're on island populations like in Queensland. And then we can look to apply names retrospectively based on what we know about the population structure. And we'll eventually be able to do that with Psilocybe cubensis as well, as we get more data from all over the world and look at how populations have been shaped. So that's the reason I call everything in Australia a Psilocybe subaeruginosa. I'm aware that there's lots of different names, but let's find how we can apply those names first based on population structure. So recently, the Psilocybe cubensis community had this massive injection of data from this group Psilocydia, who sequenced the genomes of every single commercially available line of Psilocybe cubensis, and they sequenced it from spore prints. So each spore print has millions of haplotypes of different spores. So each spore has a different genotype, essentially. So it's a crazy data set, but we can still use it to look at genetic diversity. So I've popped in our 3 genomes from Australia, which are under my dome, and I don't know how to move me. I've popped in our 3 genomes with the 80 or so from Psilocydia. And so if we treat Psilocydia, this genomic resource, as a pretty good representation of all the cubes under cultivation, essentially, then our ones from Australia are not related to anything under cultivation that's commercially available. Pretty cool, huh? So branch length in these splits trees is informative. It's reflective of genetic diversity. So our ones in Australia are that far distant, like this is a really long branch, they're really different from everything else. And then ours are also on their own long branches, which kind of shows that, you can look at the real figure of this on my blog, it kind of shows that there's more genetic diversity just in 3 genomes from Australia than in all of Golden Teacher. Or this is P Envy down here. So we're sitting on a fair bit of genetic diversity in Australia, and it's unlike everything that's under cultivation in the United States. Pretty cool. When you look at, this is golden teacher, so this is just the population. So remember, reticulation is sexual reproduction. If we saw reticulation at the ends of these tips, we'd know that they're outcrossing with each other. When we've got these tips on long branches, it's kind of an indication of something else. And because we know that Basidiomycota have to reproduce sexually to form a mushroom, I would interpret this as inbreeding. So long branches, but not reticulation at the ends of those branches. So similar genotypes are probably, rather than the result of sexual reproduction, they're the result of inbreeding, which it's a form of sexual reproduction, but from a low genetic starting point. If we saw the population of Psilocybe subaeruginosa, or when we do, it'll put it into context, I hope. Okay, so from these cube genomes, I think we're in a pretty good position to say that Psilocybe cubensis, the natural populations, at least from New South Wales and all the way up to far north Queensland, they're not introduced from commercial cultivation because they're just completely different to everything that is commercially available. So it's probably they were introduced before anyone started cultivating Psilocybe cubensis. That's my guess, based on what we've just seen. Okay, and just a little bit on mating. So mating and not mating here. And from 6 genomes of Psilocybe subaeruginosa, 6 different genomes, I was able to say, okay, well, I know which of my cultures are going to cross. 8 can potentially cross with everything because it's different at the HD loci. Homeodomain 1, homeodomain 2, and all of these technically shouldn't cross because they all have the same allele at those 2 homeodomain genes. Then the pheromone receptor genes, well, maybe 8 can cross with everything except for 2 and 4 and 7, where they each share an allele of a pheromone receptor. So 8 definitely should be able to cross with 5 and 6 because 5 and 6 doesn't share a pheromone gene with 8. What I essentially saw, and this took a couple of weeks because I didn't know what was going on for so long, what I saw was, this is 8 times 6 and there's this massive gap down the middle, and I'm like, oh man, they're not reproducing, but 5 and 6 are, and 5 and 6 shouldn't cross. It turns out that this is confluence, and there is an interaction zone going on here. So we had mating between 8 and 2, 8 and 6, 8 and 5, and 8 and 4. So 8 and 7 didn't cross, which means that one pheromone receptor is controlling mate compatibility. And the reason that I knew that something like this had crossed is because of these little clamp connections that maintain nuclear fidelity. If you remember this image, I've always been talking about the haplotype of a single basidiospore. Well, now these are little clamp connections. So when the hyphae grow, the nuclei migrate. One nucleus goes with the hyphae, and then the other one migrates later. And this is what they look like when you see them down a microscope. So to see clamp connections means that you've got a dikaryotic hyphae and that there has been sexual reproduction. Pretty cool, huh? So 5 and 6 and 8 times 7 didn't have these. Thank you everyone who sent me specimens. It's really, we're easily going to crack 100 before 1 year of the project, pretty much. Thanks to Dave H, to Kane, especially for these subs that are coming in at the moment. Okay, everything's put on the blog. I'll see if I can put that Q Health seminar on the blog if they send it to me, and check out that DMT talk if you've got time. Otherwise, that's it from me. Hopefully I'll see you down in Melbourne at the end of the year. Bye for now.
And thank you very much to Dr. Alastair McTaggart talking there about genetic diversity and his work. And if you want to find out more, make sure you subscribe to the EGA YouTube channel, and you can find his video, which we did a few months back. And if we go down, I think I might have just skipped it. There we go. Safeguarding genetic diversity of psilocybes, and that's our epic webcast. That's me talking. But you can watch a full presentation from Alistair there. It's really a really interesting and in-depth look into his research. Going now to Kane. Kane, welcome again.
Thank you very much, Nick. So tonight I just wanted to finish off this very, very long webcast with a little bit of a discussion about fungi conservation. It's a topic that's very close to my heart. I did my master's thesis on conservation mycology, so looking at a lot of the data that's present in websites such as the Atlas of Living Australia, and using that data to try to predict the threatened species assessment for a lot of Australian fungi. So it's a topic I would like to speak to. So the 3 Fs. So we often talk about flora and fauna, but in a lot of cases, the fungi get left out. And there was a recent paper that introduced this term, fungi. So we now have the 3 Fs, flora, fauna, and fungi. So fungi are fundamental to all ecosystems. There's a huge variety of species. There's millions. There's somewhere predicted to be between 2.2 to 3.8 million species of fungi. And we only know a fraction of them. There are many kinds. They come in all kinds of different shapes, different sizes. So you have like fruiting bodies that are tiny, like your molds that grow in your yogurt, for example. All these huge, beautiful bolly-shaped mushrooms. But then you also get these mycelium that will grow massively, like the armillaria in Oregon that takes up hectares and hectares of forest. They're incredibly diverse. They colonized land some 550 million years ago, give or take maybe a few million years. And they're really important, and they helped plants colonize the earth. So way on back when fungi colonized the earth, plants kind of slowly emerged onto the earth. They were very, very basic, and they very, very quickly formed a symbiotic relationship, and that relationship has been maintained ever since. And you can see here on the right-hand side, this little pine seedling. If you look closely, you can make out the 3 or 4 roots that it has. The remainder of that root system is essentially the mycorrhiza that grows in symbiosis with that tree. Fungi are also nature's recyclers. They break down plant debris and they release all those nutrients, those locked up nutrients, back into the environment. But fungi also represent homes and food for numerous other organisms, for arthropods, for insects, for bacteria and amoeba. They're whole ecosystems within themselves. And I want to try to illustrate this with the following slide. We have this beautiful Ganoderma. I wouldn't try to identify it to species. It could maybe Ganoderma australis, but possibly not. And who knows how old this is or was when I originally found it growing in the forest, but it's huge. It's a massive, massive Ganoderma. And then I went back to visit it some 10 years later, and it's rotten away, it's decomposed. But this just goes to illustrate, there's this kind of incredible ecosystem here, this food source that's seen countless generations of insect and other organisms just come and go. Another aspect of conservation, in particular, I think, to fungi, is our ecosystem degradation. As humans, we've caused significant ecological change. We're now in a period called the Anthropocene. It's this period of time when humans have just dominated the landscape and changed it incredibly. we're seeing some of these effects now with climate change, these dramatic fires and just the incredible flooding events, for example, that we've experienced in Australia this year. We have a tendency as humans to fence in nature. We turn it into squares, we cut it down, we turn forests into cleared land for agriculture. And despite all our environmental concerns, there's still ongoing forestry, for example, although in some cases there's now a whole thing about salvaging wood from forests, and this also causes significant concern. An example of this, for example, is in the Wombat State Forest in Victoria, where Vic Forests set up utilisation plans where they're essentially going in and salvaging all the trees that were fallen in the winds. And the Wombat State Forest is an environment for the sarcodon fungus, of which there's only 2 populations, and this piece of land set aside is one of those 2 locations. This is an area in Victoria that's commonly foraged for a variety of fungi. So anybody out there who does forage on this land, I seriously recommend looking at what's happening and putting in letters of protest. We need to preserve these ecosystems, whether the trees have fallen over or not. As I mentioned earlier in the Q&A, a lot of this forest debris is really important for fungi. The fungi myceliate it, and they break it down and return those nutrients to the environment. We then end up with these incredible islands of forests, patches of forests that are not connected with each other. How does this affect the animals? How does this affect the plants or the fungi? It most likely probably limits gene flow and causes problems within those populations. So this way that we manage our environment is problematic in that sense. There's also, I think, a little bit of ethnomycological conservation as well. In Australia, we don't really know a whole lot about our fungi. There's been a loss of traditional knowledge. So, for example, the European explorers and settlers that came to Australia reported some traditional usage, but many descriptions of the fungi were vague. So when we go back through journals and records, we don't really know what fungi are being referred to. We can't identify them. There have been some cases where this is possible. So, for example, Cyteria gunnii, which is that beautiful orange golf ball-like fungus that grows specifically on Nothofagus trees, which was known to be eaten raw and to be quite edible. As a culture, I think a lot of Australia, or the original European settlers who came out from Ireland and England, they brought out with them this sense of mycophobia, this fear of fungi, and kind of exhibited a sense of lack of interest. Versus then a sense of European mycophilia. So a lot of the French explorers that came out to explore Tasmania, for example, the explorer La Ballardière described many of the fungi that he came across, including the Athra rubra, this incredible kind of weird sea anemone-shaped starfish fungus, illustrated here on the right. For most of Australians, we didn't really know a whole lot about fungi. Generally, kind of, I guess, in a larger mass media sense, till Cleland published his Toadstools and Mushrooms and Other Large Fungi of South Australia in 1934-35 in 2 separate volumes. And this was the first real attempt at classifying and naming and describing a lot of Australian fungi. or at least bringing together then work that other people have done as well. So were fungi forgotten? There's certainly a lack of awareness of fungi, I feel, in our culture. And this has definitely changed within the last 20 to 30 years. And I've certainly seen this in the last 10 years. Like the amount of interest in fungi has just grown exponentially. Facebook groups, for example, there's just so many people who have jumped in and started to take interest, going out taking photographs, and just having with a sense of wanting to know which fungi are which, and just a broad curiosity. It's great to see. But there have been some contributing cultural factors in our kind of this lack of knowledge. So a lack of funding for research and collection of data. 90% of species in the National Herbarium of Victoria were represented by less than 5 collections. And this was in 1997. I'm not quite sure what the current figure would be. It'd be nice to find out. Another aspect of this is fungi have a very transient and hard to observe life cycle. I think it's kind of important to note that when you come across a fungi, this is a beautiful moment between you and the fungi. It's fruited, it's growing, it's distributing its spores, and you just happen to come across it at that right time when it's in its prime of life and it's doing its thing. It's a special moment, I feel. University courses on fungi are, for the most part, absent. There's certainly no degree in mycology, and in the most part, mycology comes kind of as a postgraduate course. You do it as part of your honours or as part of your masters, or even as part of your PhD. There are a few courses here and there. There were some lovely units, for example, at the University of Tasmania and the University of Sydney, and I think there are a few others in a few other universities now. And there has also been a distinct lack of trained mycologists, but there has been definitely an increasing number of enthusiastic citizen scientists who are out there collecting data. Particularly on social media, using resources such as iNaturalist or Mushroom Observer, and even to a degree, the Shroomery. So, as of 2009, Chapman specifies that there are around 11,846 described species of Australian fungi. There's likely to be many, many more than this. It's important to note that fungi are underrepresented in Australian state and federal conservation efforts compared to other kingdoms. In federal legislation, there are no fungi listed. There are a couple listed as threats. Like the chitri fungus, for example, that's killing off the frogs. And there's a couple of others. And there's very little state protection. A lot of the fungi listed under state protection are kind of fungi. They are fungi, but they're lichens. So, which kind of have their own kind of school in themselves. Lots of lichenologists out there who early on who went to a great deal of effort to describe, categorize, and then these have been listed. But yeah, not many macrofungi. Things are changing. In 2019, there was an IUCN workshop in Melbourne where 71 species were listed on the IUCN Red List. These were species from Australia, New Caledonia, and New Zealand. And importantly, at that same workshop, it was announced that there was funding to protect Hypocreopsis and Plectens, which is this amazing wood inhabiting. Well, it's not a wood inhabiting. It does inhabit wood, but it's actually a fungus that grows on another fungus, and we refer to it as tea tree fingers. And I recommend googling it. It's the most beautiful and kind of slightly bizarre thing. So some examples of some threatened species that were listed. So there were some critically endangered species identified, so Hypocreopsis amplectans, and then also Daconica. Now, anyone who's out collecting little brown mushrooms will be familiar with Daconica. So I think it's kind of important to note that there are some Daconica out there that are potentially threatened. There's also there were lots of endangered, but then also vulnerable species listed as well. Some of these genus names you may be familiar with, so Entheogenesis. There was the really beautiful claustula fisher's egg, which was actually the first fungus from Oceania to be listed, and that was quite some time ago. Hygrossby, for example, is another kind of familiar genus. Again, that Sarcodon species from the Wombat State Forest. And then in the vulnerable group, there's a few others. So Amanitas, Macrolepioides, Cytarias. So a few names that are kind of, commonly known, and that perhaps people are not aware of as them potentially being threatened. This is a rather interesting slide that came out of my thesis when I kind of did a bit of an overview of the data from Atlas of Living Australia. At the time I did my analysis, there were 15,892 species in the Atlas of Living Australia. And from that, I identified that there were 3,453 species that had only 3,453 species. This is less than a quarter of that approximate 16,000 species that had greater than or equal to 3 records. This is important because through geographical analysis, if we want to get to understand the distribution of a fungi, we need more than 3. So that 3 forms a triangle. That might be a small triangle, for example, in a suburban area, or that may be a triangle across a whole state. If you want to get to know more about this species, to understand it better, we need more data about these species. So essentially this sharp rise and then this shallow curve indicates there's a large number of species that have very few records. I'm going to change tack a little and move into aspects about ethical foraging. Just to point out that it's important to be respectful and to show care to the fungi, to the environment, and to each other in the community. Respect local laws and respect local practices. So we brought up in question time this question about, is it important to cut or which is better, cutting or pulling? In some places, the accepted local practice is to cut the mushroom, whereas in other places it's accepted that it's okay to pull. But again, remove the mushrooms gently. So picking with care and respect for fungi, I feel personally it's important that you identify the mushroom before you pick it. There are numerous ID guides, fungi flips, iNaturalist, PDFs that you can download onto your phone. You can possibly even use iNaturalist to take a photograph of the fungi that you're looking at within a region in situ, upload them, and hopefully they get identified while you're there. This is not to say that you can't interact with the fungus. You can't touch it or, get a sense of the texture. Has it got a sticky or a slimy cap? Is the cap kind of gently, delicate, or is it firm and fibrous? I think it's important to keep in mind that ecosystems are delicate. They're very intricate webs of interaction. Many of these fungi occur very, very randomly. They pop up within a set of given environmental triggers. And then other animals and other insects are interacting with them. Some fungi are weedy and should be taken care not to disturb. Amanita muscaria, for example, is one of these that can be weedy and ideally shouldn't be disturbed. I realize the irony of, there are videos of me pulling up amanitas and definitely showing them. But then there are also fungi, say like Favelaceae calicera, the orange ping pong bat fungus, that is becoming a significant weed. And if you do notice, you should not go near it. Don't disturb it. I've already covered that point on cutting and pulling. Research shows that there's little difference between the two. And I'd like to kind of reiterate that point when you're pulling up a mushroom, remove it gently. Only pick what you need. Some fungi fruit multiple times over a season, and some fungi may only fruit once or twice. So keep in mind what you need, but also keep in mind that the fungus in situ. And I guess another aspect that I should point out is not to go trampling through spots. Try to keep to tracks. So sometimes trampling can actually compress the soil. It can, which can possibly affect the mycelium that's underfoot. Another point is to consider tissue culturing to grow your own. So, for example, if you're out foraging for some of the wood-loving species like the native shiitake or Ganoderma, for example, turkey tails, it is possible to do your own tissue cultures and then grow these at home in your own growing environment, rather than foraging from the forest and potentially damaging those beautiful big conchs, those existing ecosystems. Slow mushrooming. Be gentle, be deliberate. Try to leave no trace where possible. Step gently. Take home what you take in with you. Try not to take glass with you. Glass is very, very easily broken and could cause risk to other foragers. Take empty bags with you and try to collect rubbish if you can. And to come back to this aspect of showing care and respect for each other, go slowly, peacefully, tread softly. Again, slow mushrooming. There are lots of people out there who are foraging for peace and relaxation. So please be respectful of that. If you go out picking on your own, let others know where you're going to be. If you're picking as a group, make sure you look out for each other and check in with each other regularly. Make sure you're all okay and staying warm and dry. And again, mindfulness with respect to waste. Only pick what you need. Don't, take out what you take in with you. And be respectful of the environment that you're working in, foraging in. And also remember the law. So depending on where you are in the world, so with private land, it is universal to not remove plants or fungi from private property without the permission of the owner. So seek permission. And gifts can go some way. In some countries, this is different, though. I mean, in Australia, it's illegal to forage for any plant or fungi, to remove any organism from public land. But in the UK and the Commons, there is a right to forage for personal use. In the United States, in national parks are defined. The rules are defined by the park superintendent. The type of mushroom you can forage for, the method, the quantity, and the locations. And again, yes, in Australia, any removal of plant or fungi is illegal without a permit. I think at this point I'm going to finish on this slide. There's this growing sense of ecodelia. I love this particular painting, mushroom picking. I'm sure many of us out there can relate to this, to be out foraging for fungi and just to be able to be in tune with the forest, just to enjoy the peace and the serenity of where you are, to listen to the sounds and enjoy company with friends. And that's me. I'm going to stop sharing, jump out. I can't hear you, Nick.
My gosh, I just did that whole thing without my microphone turned on. I'm so sorry. This data is the crime data. I just wanted to quickly show you that in Victoria that people are still charged for crimes relating to psilocybin and to other hallucinogens, and that's a word under the Victorian sort of legalese structure. So those four that I have highlighted there are possession of drug of dependence hallucinogen, possession of drug of dependence hallucinogen, attempted possess psilocybin specifically. And if we look here, what I was highlighting while my microphone was turned off is that over the past 5 years, we have seen a significant rise in the number of people charged for possession of psilocybin. You compare this to 10 years ago, and there was 0. Now, we had 33 last year, 37 the year before. And what I was just touching on when I realised my mic was off was use of drug of dependence. And use is based on not just you saying, I have used psilocybin before. You can still have these conversations, but if you give a time and a place when you did that, and if police are watching that, or if you think that maybe it's a good idea to have that discussion with police, it's not, then that is a crime. You have committed the crime of use of a drug of dependence, hallucinogen, psilocybin, whatever it happens to be. Hallucinogen is a catch-all when they can't determine what substance it might have been, but they know that it's hallucinogen. I can put the link for that data into the chat as well, but I just wanted to sort of highlight it and just remind you that these are still prohibited substances in Australia, in Victoria. And yeah, it's important to remember. Thank you very much to everyone who has stuck around for tonight's broadcast as well. Just want to also highlight my community, Myco community. My community do excellent work on a broad range of mushroom issues. They do workshops, they do talks, and really worth checking out their work. Kane also works with my community. So yeah, it would be go and support them, and you'll be able to find some interesting stuff there, and I'll get our moderators to drop that into the chat. If you do have any questions for Kane, I can come to those very finally, but I have a feeling I was watching there that some of the questions that people were asking, Kane was managing to answer along the way, so that was great. Thank you, Kane. And also, if you wanted to watch some more info on mushrooms, last year the Australian Psychedelic Society, in collaboration with my community, presented on mushrooms. You can find that by going to their YouTube channel, hitting mushrooms/psilocybin, and you'll see that playlist there where we have a whole bunch of videos, including there Kane again, speaking about psilocybin research, about mushrooms more broadly, and about psychedelic research. That was from last year, but a lot of it is still relevant now. And finally, Garden States 2022, because that's what we're heading towards. Garden States is December 2nd to 4th this year. You can buy your tickets now. They are finally on sale, and there are plenty of speakers. We'll be able to see you in person, which we very much look forward to. We'll be able to meet in person, have conversations, have the sort of conversations that are very difficult to have on a YouTube comment section. We really appreciate that you do leave comments and keep engaged with these conversations, but gosh, it's so much better in person. A few of the speakers there, I'll just scroll down, you'll see a huge number, but you can find that all at the Garden States website. And to buy your tickets, all you have to do is click on that link, buy tickets now, and you'll go to the Buy Tickets Now website where you can now purchase those. If you were on the list for a notification when tickets were on sale, you will have a discount code as well. So make sure to check your email to find that. If you hadn't been able to find that and you were on that list, check your spam folder as well, but you can get in touch with EGA as well. I'll get our moderators to drop an email into the chat, but you can also find it at gardenstates.org. And for those who already bought tickets, those tickets of course are still valid for Garden States, so do grab your ticket. We look forward to seeing you. It's going to be in Springvale at the Springvale City Hall, where if you were at our Garden States event a few years ago before the pandemic happened, that's where the location will be, and it's a really nice location, and we really look forward to seeing you there. So thank you everyone for being here on what might have been our longest webcast yet. We really appreciate you staying to the end, and make sure to share this information with anybody that might be interested, friends, family, colleagues, peers, whoever they are. Share it around, because we are looking to find the others. We're looking to find those who are interested in this sort of information, those who want to engage and to share not just the knowledge but also the community, and to grow that community. So thank you to everyone. I'm going to leave us tonight on a final video. This final video is about psilocybe. Kane, pronunciation?
Psilocybe eleuticea.
Thank you, eleuticea. It's always tricky with these names, especially if you're used to just reading them on a screen, because your mind just comes up with different ways of pronunciation. But I'm going to leave you with that video tonight. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Entheogenesis Australis has created this series of short videos describing a number of species of psilocybe and allied species found in Australia. In this video, I'm going to introduce and discuss the temperate species Psilocybe eleuticea.
Hello, my name's Kane Barlow. I'm an Australian mycologist. I have a particular interest in the genus Psilocybe, particularly Australian species. Psilocybe eleuticea is still a fairly new psilocybe. The description was published in 2006 by Chang and Mills. There's still a lot of excitement about this species. We've only really known about them for about 15 years. So people are really keen to get out into the bush and to go and find them for their first time. The common name is the poo meanie, named by Bo Meister. In the Chang and Mills paper, the species was described as resembling Psilocybe semilanceata. The pharmacology of the species is currently unknown. In terms of history, the holotype for the species was collected in 1990 by Weyers Chang. found on the Snug Falls track in Tasmania. Herbarium specimens were collected in 1990, 1991 and 2000. I recall in the early 90s in Tasmania, there were rumours getting around of a wombat poo-loving psilocybe being found around Snug Falls, and people would quite often go looking for it. I never found one, unfortunately. Online reports appeared on Mushroom Observer in 2011. And then further reports started appearing on other sites, the Shroomery, Mushroom Observer, and Facebook groups from 2013, 2015, 2016, and now they're fairly regular. Again, the common name is the poo meanie. A huge shout out to Bo Meister for a very, very cool name. The image on the right hand side here is the hand-drawn illustration for Psilocybe eludicea from the Chang, Gates and Rakowski paper from 2006. This is Snug Falls in Tasmania, where the first specimen was found. You can see in the photograph that it's mostly calodendrous rainforest, and then that would then change into wet sclerophyll forest. The habitat for Psilocybe eludicea is wet and dry eucalypt forest, but also rainforest. It grows off animal dung, in particular wombat dung and also wallaby dung. It's found in Tasmania, Victoria, South Australia, and is also known to occur in New Zealand. Its season, it grows generally between March to July, but has been found in February. There's the possibility that the season extends much greater, so we're still in the process of gathering that data as a community. I'm going to show some photographs of habitats where eludicea occurs. So this is wet sclerophyll. You can see the eucalyptus, you can see the man ferns. You would expect a few other trees here as well, bedfordia, for example. Temperate rainforest. So this is a picture of calodendrous rainforest from Tasmania. And this is the understory of a similar kind of calodendrous rainforest. You can see the ferns and all the broken debris on the ground. This is an image provided by Tanner Koolhaas showing the mushroom against a 5-cent coin. You can see it's not a huge mushroom. Taxonomically speaking, Psilocybe eludicea, the cap is 13 millimeters in diameter, conical or convex in shape. It's quite striate and has a leathery brown to ochraceous brown colour. The gills, the attachment is adnate, greyish brown in colour. The stem, 46 millimeters tall, white to pale brown. And as with many other psilocybe, they bruise blue where damaged. You can see in this image here on the right hand side the described similarity to stem lanceata. That white, slightly brown, fibrous looking stem. When foraging for any kind of edible fungus, it's really important to be aware of the potential lookalike species. Some are poisonous and some are deadly. Our advice here at EGA is to know the species that you are foraging for, understand the taxonomy and how the species is described, know its habitat and its substrate, but also to be aware of what poisonous lookalike species may exist. There are a few lookalikes, Diconica species, as illustrated here on the right hand side, but also Paniolus species and also Protostropharia semiglobata can also look similar. Thank you for joining me today as we've explored a number of Australian psilocybe species.
And that's just about us for tonight. But just finally, for those of you who have joined us from elsewhere in the world, from interstate, who might be thinking that you're interested in the Garden States event, but you're not sure how to attend, Garden States will also offer an online component, so you will be able to watch parts of the Garden States event as well. Definitely better if you're there in person. It'd be lovely to see you there. But if you can't, you'll still be able to get some Garden States information. So all the information about that is at the website, and you'll be able to find that at gardenstates.org. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night.